You are already awake, though. The world beyond your shuttered windows still clings to sleep, and the hush that fills your small, crooked house is not the kind that invites dreams, but the sort that holds its breath before a storm, the kind that feels thick and waiting and old. The air is damp and cold, and as you sit at the edge of your straw mattress, rubbing your hands together slowly, listening to the wind creak the rafters and the distant call of a cockerel far off in someone else's morning, you wonder if today will be quiet or if it will end with the square stained darker than the cobbles beneath. There is no fire yet. The hearth is empty, just gray-white ash from last night's ember-flickered sleep. But the cold has always suited you more than the heat. And anyway, you have work to do before warmth. You reach for the heavy leather apron folded neatly on the stool by your door, the one you do not wear in town or at the market, the one that smells of oil and iron, and something else that you've never quite managed to describe, but which always clings to the edges of your breath, no matter how many times you scrub your hands with sand and vinegar. You light a taper crouch and bring the flame to the oil lamp on your table, a small, flickering island of light that dances across the rough-hewn beams and tools set carefully in their places. They're lined like old soldiers on a wooden rack, are the instruments of your particular trade, the short-handled axe, the long-handled one, the curved beheading sword you use when the town magistrate insists on dignity, and the long iron tongs used for less graceful duties. There is a whetstone too pale and worn and beloved in the quiet way a carpenter loves a chisel, or a scribe his favorite quill. You take it in your palm, wet it from a small clay pot, and begin to drag the edge of steel against stone in slow, deliberate motions that echo faintly in the room like whispers from another time. There is a rhythm to it. Swish, scrape, pause. Swish, scrape, breathe. You do not hurry. You never hurry this part. It is a kind of prayer not to God he has never been quite comfortable company for you. Not since you were a boy and saw your father swinging the axe for the first time, but perhaps to some older spirit, the kind that sits behind laws and watches over grim tasks no one wants to speak of. Your father said it was the whetstone that kept his hand steady, not courage or conviction, and you've come to believe him. Outside, the mist has begun to lift. Pale light seeps over the hills in the distance, soft and golden and merciless. You pull back the shutter and watch it spread across the fields, the rooftops, the empty gallows at the far edge of the square, that black outline like a scarecrow waiting to be filled. No birds perch there, not ever. It is a silence within a silence. There will be a death today. You've known it since yesterday morning, when the constable came with his slow voice and awkward eyes, handed you the scroll without looking you in the face, and left with a muttered blessing he surely didn't mean. The sentence is already passed. The crime, poaching, thievery, blasphemy, murder. It hardly matters in the moment of execution. Your role is not to weigh sin, only to end its consequence. You've been given the name, the hour, and the place. That is all you ever need. You wash the blade with wine not because it needs cleansing, but because there is an old belief that steel kept wet with wine remembers fewer screams. You're not sure if it is true, but you do it anyway, out of habit or hope or some part of you that still clings to little rituals that make the work feel like something more than slaughter. Then you wrap the blade in cloth, tie the bundle with twine, and place it gently in a sack. You have time still. The execution is not until noon, and the square will not begin to gather until the church bell strikes 11. You could sit or eat or walk down the road to see if the baker has any bread left over from yesterday, that no one else would buy the misshapen loaves he often saves for you, though he never says so aloud. But instead, you sit at the edge of your bench, and watch the light slowly cross the floorboards, inching toward your feet, as though the day itself is creeping toward the moment it must hand you the burden once again. Sometimes, in these hours before the deed, you think about the condemned. You wonder if they're awake too, sitting in a damp cell with shackles on their wrists, staring at the cracks in the wall and thinking about mothers or rivers or the way sunlight feels on the back of the neck. You wonder if they cry or rage or simply stare in silence. You wonder if they've accepted it. You wonder if you have. The village is beginning to stir. A dog barks once, then again. A cart rumbles past your door, its wheels creaking like old bones. You hear someone chopping wood in the distance. Life goes on always, even when it ends. And you are the one who sees it end. You rise, stretch your back until it cracks, and take the sack with the blade inside. The apron goes over your tunic, the hood stays off for now. You do not wear it until the final moment. The hood is not for you, it is for them. So they won't see your face, though many know it anyway. So they can imagine you as something faceless, nameless, a function, instead of a man. You have come to understand that mercy sometimes wears strange disguises. At the door, you pause. The mist is lifting. The village is waking. And in the square, the scaffold waits empty and expectant. You step outside. You walk the road not as a stranger, and yet not as one of them either, for the people you pass, if they must pass you at all, tend to do so quickly and without much in the way of words or warmth, their heads dipped low or turned slightly to the side, their eyes scanning anything but your face as though acknowledging your presence might summon something foul or invite misfortune to follow them home like an unwanted guest clinging to their heels. And so it is that your walk to the square is a quiet one, not only because of the early hour and the hush that still clings to the morning air, but because silence is the only greeting you are ever given. Your boots fall on the packed earth road with a steady, practiced rhythm, neither hurried nor hesitant, and though there are no crowds yet, you feel the shape of the square forming in your mind, the raised scaffold with its timbers darkened by use and weather, and time the iron nails bent slightly in their sockets, the creaking of the wooden platform beneath your feet as you test it. Before the moment comes, the smell of dried blood and old straw that never quite leaves, no matter how many times the bailiffs scrub it clean. You know every inch of it, every board and nail, every notch and groove, and you carry it within you, like a second body, a stage you inhabit for only minutes at a time, but which has come to feel more like home than the cottage at the edge of town ever has. In the sack slung over your shoulder rests your chosen blade for today's work. Not the long sword reserved for noblemen, nor the short one used for dismemberment, but the simple beheading axe, broad and slightly curved, heavy enough to do its work in one clean stroke if your arms are true and your mind steady. You chose it the night before after sitting with the scroll and reading the condemned man's name aloud to the fire, not as a ritual, not exactly, but as a small, wordless acknowledgement of what was to come, the way a bell is rung before Mass, not to summon God, but to warn the silence that something is about to happen. The condemned man is a thief, or so you were told. He took something he should not have, or perhaps from someone he should not have taken it from. And while the town's justice is not always consistent, it is always final once written in ink and sealed with wax. You do not ask what it was. You do not ask who he is. Those are not your questions. Your task lies only at the end of all questions, when the talking stops and the blade descends. And that is why the town needs you, not because you are cruel or eager or made of stone, but because you are the only one who does not flinch when the time comes. You pass beneath the old elm tree that marks the edge of the square, its branches bare even in spring, its roots wrapped around old secrets and older bones. You think sometimes that the tree must remember more than any living person does, standing as it has, through 100 executions, and 1,000 whispered fears, never speaking, never weeping, just watching. You touch its bark as you pass, not reverently, but respectfully, like one tradesman nodding to another who understands the weight of silence. The scaffold is empty, as it always is at this hour, though the bailiffs have already set the wooden block in place and spread the straw around its base to catch what must fall. They nod to you as you approach, and you nod back, not as friends, not even as comrades, but as men who share in a work that no one else will do, and whose brief acknowledgments carry more weight than any spoken comfort could. You climb the steps slowly, not because you are weary, but because you do not rush this part, the ascent to the place where one life ends, and another must carry the memory of it. The boards groan under your boots, familiar and unwilling, and you set your sack down carefully beside the block, kneeling to unwrap the blade with steady hands. You test its edge with your thumb, not to draw blood, but to feel the promise of sharpness, the tension that lassa in well-kept steel. It is ready. You are ready. The morning is unfolding exactly as it always has, and yet even now there is still a moment, a small one, a sliver between thoughts, where you wonder if this will be the time something goes wrong. A tremble in your hand, a misstep, a shout from the crowd, a last-second pardon that never comes. You let the thought pass as you always do, and begin to pace the scaffold, measuring the space once more. Below, the townsfolk are beginning to arrive. They come in pairs and small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, their breath visible in the morning air. Some come for justice, some for spectacle, and a few for reasons that you try not to think about, come for pleasure. The children are made to stand near the back, though some are hoisted onto shoulders when the crowd thickens, small faces peering with wide, unblinking eyes at the platform they do not yet understand. The condemned man is brought out between two guards. He stumbles once on the cobbles, but does not fall. His shirt is torn, his hands bound, his face pale and quiet. He looks up at the scaffold, not with terror, but with the kind of resignation that grows in the corners of prisons, where light is thin and hope thinner still. You watch him as he climbs. He does not resist. He does not cry. When he stands before you, swaying slightly on unsteady legs, you give him the smallest nod, a gesture without meaning, except to say, "I see you. I am here. It will be done quickly." The bailiff reads the sentence. His voice is loud, but hollow, as if even he is tired of hearing the same words repeated day after day, year after year. You do not listen. You have heard it all before. Instead, you kneel once more and raise the axe. The condemned kneels too. His eyes close. The wind stills. And in that moment there is nothing else, no crowd, no sky, no time. Only the weight in your hands and the silence that always comes just before the fall. There is no sound like it. No true way to describe it. Not the rustle of grain underfoot, nor the snap of wood in a hearth. Not the whistle of wind through a chapel's broken window, nor even the thick final silence of a grave being filled. There is nothing quite like the sound an axe makes when it passes through the space between a man's last breath and the earth that waits below nothing, like that sickening, sacred, split-second hush between swing and sever, between judgment and oblivion, between what he was and what he will never be again. You feel it in your arms first, the momentum, the resistance, the trembling stillness afterward that fills your shoulders with lead and your stomach with something you have never named aloud. And then you hear the soft thud that follows a sound so brief and so precise that it barely registers with the ears, but lingers somehow behind the ribs, like an echo that never reaches the air. The body slumps forward. The head rolls once, perhaps twice, and is then quickly gathered into the cloth-covered basket by one of the assistants whose eyes are fixed on the task, with a blankness you know too well. The blankness not of carelessness, but of discipline, of the sort of mental armor one must forge when one's duties require standing knee-deep in other people's endings. There is no triumph, no flourish. You do not raise the blade for the crowd, though in some cities that is tradition, and though some among them might crave that gesture, the clean symbol of completion. You are not a performer, not truly. The blade is lowered, the body is taken, the crowd begins to shift. They do not cheer, not always. Sometimes, if the condemned was hated, there are shouts, a few claps, the sharp, ugly bark of satisfaction. Other times there is only murmuring, a restless murmuring, like leaves being stirred by wind. And soon enough, they begin to scatter toward stalls selling broth and spiced wine toward tasks. They paused toward errands that suddenly feel urgent again. They leave because the deed is done and because to linger too long near the place of death is to risk remembering that it might come for them too one day, when the magistrates grow cold or the gods grow impatient, or a simple mistake crosses the wrong man's path. You stand there for a moment longer, letting the quiet gather around your boots, letting your arms fall to your sides, as if the blade's weight has drained out of you and left only a husk with a name letting the wind lift the edges of your cloak like fingers that do not fear you. And you think not of the man whose body is even now being dragged toward the burial cart, nor of the sentence that brought him here, nor of the sin that may or may not have been real, but of how the sky looks this morning, how strangely blue it is, how clean the air feels in your lungs despite the work just done. Someone calls your name, a low voice respectful in a manner that is more professional than kind. The bailiff, perhaps. He nods once. There will be paperwork or whatever passes for it in your small town, a notation, a sealed document, a few coins placed in a wooden box that will appear on your doorstep tomorrow, with no name attached. You nod back. No words are exchanged. There is no need. You descend the steps slowly, your boots tapping in rhythm with the soundless prayers of a dozen observers who will later tell the story over bread and beer, each shaping the tale to suit the tone of the room. He barely flinched, they'll say, or the blade was so fast I don't think the man even felt it, or I looked into the executioner's eyes and saw nothing at all, as though you were not a man, but a mirror in which they glimpsed their own discomfort and called it yours. The tools must be cleaned. That is your next task, not because the law says so, not because the bailiffs would complain, but because it is something you must do, something your father taught you, and his father before him, something that has nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with honor or pride, or perhaps simply control. You cannot undo the death. You cannot offer comfort to the widow. You cannot change the weight of the blade in your memory, but you can clean it. You can oil it. You can wipe away the blood until it shines again, until it no longer remembers the neck it parted. And so you leave the square by the same narrow road you came passing again, beneath the bare-armed elm tree, which seems to sigh each time you cross its roots. A child watches you go, thumb in mouth, eyes wide and uncertain. You do not look away, but neither do you smile. Let them see you. Let them remember. Back in your house, your solitary, crooked little house at the edge of things, you set the blade gently on the table and begin your ritual. The cloth is soft and damp, the oil thick and familiar, and as you rub the edge of the axe with slow, circular movements, you feel the tension begin to ebb from your fingers. Not disappear entirely. Never that, but recede like a tide pulling itself backward, just far enough to let your shoulders drop and your breath return to its ordinary rhythm. You do not speak during this time. You do not think of the man's name. You do not wonder what he stole or from whom. You let your mind go quiet, not empty, just still like a pond undisturbed by wind or stone. The room is small and plain, but in this hour it feels like a sanctuary, a place not of rest exactly, but of containment. Outside, the world continues. Inside, the blade shines. Sometimes you think of writing things down. Not a confession. There is nothing to confess but a record, perhaps something simple and private, a list of names or a tally mark for each soul delivered into the dark. But you do not. Not because you are afraid of what such a ledger might contain, but because some things once written become too real. The day will unfold now as it always does. You will eat. You will sit. You may walk along the river path where no one else goes, the one that curls behind the mill, and leads to the hollow where birds nest in the reeds, and even the wind lowers its voice. You will not be invited to the tavern. You will not be asked to dance at any feast. If someone in town nods to you, it will be the kind of nod given to a storm cloud, distant, wary, and grateful, only when it passes. But you will remain, and the blade will remain. And someday soon there will be another scroll, another dawn, another man standing on the scaffold, eyes closed, waiting. You do not seek it. You do not flee it. You are the one who remains when all others turn away. Your house sits not just at the physical margin of the village, but at the spiritual one too, a place tethered to the edge of things, to the places between rules and prayers, between hearth and gallows, between what is done and what is feared. And though its walls are of the same timber and daub as any other house in the parish, though its shutters are of the same weather-worn oak, and its chimney sends up the same occasional plume of smoke, everyone knows without needing to speak it aloud that it is not like the others, that this place holds the weight of something old and unpleasant and necessary, something no one wishes to name, but all agree must be housed somewhere, and so it is here with you. The garden outside, though small and tangled, grows herbs all the same: parsley, rue marjoram, and mint. And sometimes the midwife will appear at your gate with her scarf pulled high and her eyes fixed anywhere but on your face to ask in a hurried whisper whether you still keep mugwort or valerian root, for there is a child who will not sleep, or a woman whose belly has begun to turn. You always give it freely. You never charge. And she always leaves quickly, without thanks, without farewell, without looking back. Inside the rooms are plain, not because you lack money, but because you lack company, and because beauty in a space where silence lingers thick as dust, and where the tools of your craft lean against the back wall like dark resting animals, feels not just unnecessary, but out of place like painting flowers on a gravestone. The hearth is your comfort, the bench your rest, the shelf with jars and oils your chapel. The axe, always cleaned and wrapped and set aside, rests not far but not near either, as if even when idle it demands a respectful distance. There are days when no one calls for you. These are the days that slip by gently, like mist along the river, and they are filled with the quiet rituals of a man who has learned not to expect interruption, fetching water from the well before the sun climbs too high, mending the loose hinge on the back gate, turning the soil in the small patch of garden until your hands smell of roots and damp earth, and the ache in your spine feels honest. You eat when hungry, you sleep when tired, and in between you listen to the birds in the thatch, to the wind in the chimney, to the creak of wood that marks the hours better than any bell. You speak rarely, for there is no one to speak to but yourself, and even then, you find that words feel heavy in your mouth, like stones sucked smooth by time and use. And so instead of speaking, you hum sometimes low, tuneless murmurs that seem to soothe the silence rather than disturb it, like water poured into an empty cup. There are no visitors save the bailiff with his scrolls, or the occasional supplicant who arrives under cover of dusk, whispering of a child's fever or a bad luck that won't lift, begging for a touch of your hand, for the strange healing that folks say lives in the fingers of a man who has touched so much death. You never refuse them, not because you believe in the old tales, though some part of you might, in the quietest corners of your thoughts, but because you know that to refuse them would be to become exactly what they fear. You are a creature without compassion, a shadow with no soul. So you let them come, these desperate ones, and you press your hand to their child's brow or rub their aching joints with oil and silence. And they thank you only with their eyes, for their mouths dare not speak kindness to a man whose work lives in fear. At the market, when you do go, which is not often, and never on festival days, you keep to the far edge where the tanners and the charcoal men stake their stalls, and you bring coin like any other man, though. No one counts it aloud in your presence, and the tradesmen hand you your bread or your cloth or your salt, without question, quickly, without touching your hand, if they can help it. Sometimes you catch them wiping the spot where your fingers touch the counter, not with cruelty, but with instinct, as though they themselves do not quite understand what they're doing. Only that it must be done for safety, for decency, for some old fear passed down like a prayer. You do not blame them. That is the strange thing. The thing even you have never fully understood. You do not blame them. You would avoid yourself too, if you could. You understand the logic of their distance, their superstition, their sideways glances and muttered words. You understand because once long ago, before the axe first touched your hands, before your father took you to the scaffold and told you without drama that this would be your future, you too believed that a hangman was not truly a man, but something else, something necessary perhaps, but also something cursed. It is only after you have lived the life that you learn the truth that the curse does not lie in the work itself, but in the loneliness it demands. For what is worse than the cruelty of others is the silence it leaves behind, the empty chair across the table, the hand you cannot reach for the laughter you hear in the village but never join. You are alone not because you are monstrous, but because your presence reminds people that justice is not always noble and that death is never clean. And yet, despite all of this, despite the solitude, despite the fear in children's eyes, and the way even the dogs refuse to follow you down the lane, there is a kind of peace to it, a grim and quiet peace in the knowing that your role, as thankless and bleak as it may be, spares others from becoming what you must be. For without you, someone else, some farmer, some priest, some magistrate's boy, would have to do the deed and carry the memory of it and try to sleep with the image of wide, pleading eyes and the sickening weight of a blade paused above a neck. So you take the burden and you bear it alone, and your little house, for all its emptiness, is at least honest. It makes no demands. It offers no lies. It simply waits for your return, as constant and quiet as the work you were born to do. And tonight, as the sky darkens and the last glow of day slips beneath the trees, you will sit by your fire, wrap your hands around a bowl of thin stew, and listen to the wind tapping lightly at the shutter, like a visitor who knows better than to enter. And you will sleep. Perhaps not soundly, but you will sleep. Though your house is quiet and your village small, and though the work you do there feels as heavy and personal as the tools you carry, the truth is that yours is not a name known only in one parish or one town. For there are occasions rare but inevitable when you are called beyond your own familiar borders, summoned to other cities, other scaffolds, other gallows that lean slightly in different winds, and there amid strangers and unfamiliar streets, your work continues unchanged in purpose, though altered in rhythm and tone. It begins with a letter, perhaps sealed in wax, and carried by a rider in the colors of some distant magistrate. His horse lathered from long travel, his eyes wary, his words careful. Who hands you the folded parchment, as if it might bite him, and then steps back just slightly, as though expecting the air to darken around you. Or it comes with a bailiff at your own door, his cloak still dusted with frost or rain, explaining in his stilted way that a nearby town has had a criminal condemned, but no one with the proper expertise to carry out the sentence. And so once more it is you they ask for. You do not protest. You never do. You nod. Take the letter, pack the axe or sword as the case demands, and tie your cloak tight around your shoulders for the road ahead. Whether it is 2 miles or 20, the weight of the journey is the same, not the distance, but the knowledge that you will arrive in a place where no one knows your face but will still know exactly who you are the moment they see you. It is in your posture, your silence, the way you watch the sky instead of meeting their gaze. They always know, and so you ride or walk or sit in the back of a cart with your bundle beside you, watching fields pass like pages in a book you've read too many times, until the roofs of another town rise before you, and the smell of unfamiliar hearth fires drifts toward your nose, and someone there is always someone points you out as you arrive, and whispers to the next person what they've heard. He's the one. The man who ends things. The man who makes the law real. These towns are never the same, but they all feel familiar. The square might be cobbled or dirt wide or narrow, with a market that spills into crooked alleys or stalls that huddle close like gossiping hens. There is always a tavern and always a church, and always a scaffold, some newly built for the occasion, its wood still pale and raw, and others blackened by time and weather, and old stains that no one talks about. Sometimes the condemned has already been brought out when you arrive, and sometimes you are given an hour or a day to rest, to eat, to sit in a borrowed room, where even the chair avoids creaking, and the bed feels too clean. You rarely speak to the people who bring you there. The officials know the sentence, and you know the duty. That is enough. If they offer you a coin pouch, you take it. If they offer wine, you sip once and say nothing. Some are polite, stiff with ceremony, eager to show they are not cruel, just firm, just lawful. Others are cold, and you prefer that. You have never trusted the ones who smile during executions. The condemned, when you see them, are no different here than at home. They are pale or proud to trembling, or still muttering prayers in languages they barely understand, or staring at you with hatred that sharpens as the final moment nears. You feel no pleasure in it. You feel no revenge. You do not look for innocence or guilt. The only truth you are asked to deliver is a clean end. And so you do. You mount strange scaffolds and judge strange steps. You feel the wind against your back and wonder briefly whose blood has darkened these planks before. The crowd always gathers, and it always murmurs, and when the deed is done, it always turns away, some relieved, some sickened, some grimly satisfied, as if justice were a coin they had purchased and now clutched in their palm. You wipe the blade, you wrap it, you descend. Sometimes they thank you. Those are the worst days. There have been times, not many, but enough to remember, when a nobleman requested a private execution hidden from the eyes of the town. Some matter of family honor or political embarrassment. Something delicate that required a death, but not a scene. And in those moments, your task becomes stranger still, for the quietness does not feel like mercy, but like a secret being swallowed, and you feel more than ever like a shadow being used to erase another. These noble deaths are cleaner in one sense. The condemned is usually calm, even prepared, and the room is warm with candles flickering on thick wooden tables and guards standing at attention like statues. But it is no easier, for the hush in such chambers is a different kind of weight. It does not weep or curse or gasp. It watches and it remembers. You are paid more for such work. Sometimes there is a purse of silver, sometimes a fine cloak or a ring that once belonged to the dead. You accept it because to refuse would be taken as an insult, and because these tokens, strange as they are, feel less like payment and more like proof that the act truly happened, that you were there, that the blade fell, and that you did not simply imagine the sorrow in that final breath. When the task is done, you are not offered a place to stay. They expect you to leave, and you do. You rise early or walk through the night. You take the road with the stars above and the damp earth below and the sound of your own footfalls in between, and you do not sing or whistle or pray. You just walk. And as you return, whether to your own home or to the next place that needs you, you carry with you not guilt, not in the way people might assume, but a kind of gathering silence, a weight of remembered faces and final moments. Not all of them clear, some already blurred by time or by mercy, but all of them still present like the lingering warmth of a fire that's already gone to ash. You return to your house and the door creaks as always, and the air smells as it should. You wash your hands, you hang your cloak, you sit, and the axe once more is laid to rest. You have come to understand, not from books or sermons or any learned discourse, but from the sheer repetition of your station, from the weight of years and the countless footsteps you've taken to and from scaffold, gallows, block, and grave that justice. Despite all its pageantry, its declarations, its seals and scrolls and magistrates in fur-trimmed robes, is not one single thing, not a fixed star shining purely above the heads of men, but something fluid, shifting, shaped by power and fear and pride as much as by law, something that wears many faces and speaks in many tongues, and sometimes in darker moments seems to have no face at all, only a hand holding a pen and another hand holding a sword. There are sentences that fall swiftly without trial, where a noble's accusation is proof enough, and the condemned is walked straight from a cell to the rope without ever being heard. And then there are trials that stretch for days, full of shouting and parchment, and witnesses who tremble and cry and contradict themselves so frequently that truth begins to resemble smoke there, but impossible to hold. There are punishments for theft that result in death, and others where the same crime ends only in a branding iron pressed to the skin or a hand nailed to the town post. And you, though you ask no questions and speak no judgment, cannot help but see the pattern in who receives which fate. You have seen a boy of 14 taken for stealing a loaf of bread, hands tied with rough rope that bit into the same wrists that had surely once been cradled in a mother's arms. And you have seen a lord's son, red-cheeked and smug, ride past on a stolen horse, with no fear of rope or blade, for his name was a kind of armor no axe could cut through. You have taken heads and lives from the desperate, the petty, the wrongfully accused, and the obviously guilty, and still you cannot say that the scales were ever truly balanced. And yet the law calls, and you must answer, for if you refuse even once, the whole fragile edifice might crack, and the townsfolk who look upon you with fear and disgust may begin to feel something worse than fear, uncertainty, and the question of what happens when those who deliver the law no longer believe in it. So you do not refuse. You do not question aloud. You read the scroll, you prepare the blade, you perform the sentence as written. But inside, within the quietest corners of yourself, the part no crowd sees and no magistrate addresses you, carry the names, not all of them, but some etched into your memory, not with ink, but with sensation. The girl who wept without sound and kissed her own hand before placing it on the block. The man who looked you straight in the eye and nodded once as if granting you permission to continue. The mother who begged only that her child not be made to watch. These are not mere figures. These are people you remember not by crime or date, but by the way the air felt in the square that morning, or the look in their eyes as the shadow of the axe fell across their shoulders. There is no law that acknowledges these things. There is no scroll that records them. But they are real. And then, too, there are the punishments that are not death, those other tasks that fall to you when the sentence is disfigurement, humiliation, or suffering stretched across time rather than ended in an instant. The stocks, the pillory, the flogging post, all these instruments are part of your trade, though you do not favor them. You have no taste for drawn-out pain. It sits poorly with you, a taste like copper at the back of your throat. And yet it is part of the role, part of the contract, unspoken, but deeply known that the hand which kills must also be the hand that wounds when required. There was a man once, a baker's assistant, slow-witted but kind, who was accused of defiling a shrine. The priest was furious, the townsfolk incensed. You doubted the story, for you had seen the boy many times carrying sacks of flour, too big for his small back, whistling tunelessly shy, but never cruel. But it was not for you to doubt. The sentence was public lashing. You performed it. You struck him 12 times as ordered, and each blow landed not only on his skin, but somewhere deep inside you, somewhere that flinched each time the whip snapped. He survived, but you never saw him again. Some said he left the village. Others said he died of fever. You never found out. Still, the whip was cleaned and oiled, the order fulfilled. The law once again was made visible. On other days, the punishments are stranger still. You once hanged a sack of grain to symbolize the exile of a miller too ill to appear. You were asked to slap a fence post to represent the shaming of a merchant who had already fled. You rang a bell 3 times for a crime committed by a ghost. At least that's what the priest whispered when he handed you the order. These acts feel theatrical, almost comic, and yet the villagers attend, they watch, they nod solemnly, for the performance of justice matters more than its substance, and you, though you are not a priest or actor, are both in moments like these. It is a strange power to represent the law so completely, and yet belong to none of its comforts. You are not invited to the feasts where magistrates toast successful trials. You are not given the warm nods of the guildsmen or the casual affection of townsfolk who wave to each other in passing. You are the instrument, not the institution. You are the hand, not the voice. And when the law fails, when the wrong man is punished or the guilty go free, it is not the judges they curse in the alleyways or over tankards in the tavern. It is you, always you. You carry this with you, not proudly, but plainly. It is a second cloak heavier than wool. And still, when the scroll arrives, you read it. When the scaffold calls, you climb it. When the blade dulls, you sharpen it. Because if you do not, someone else will. Someone with less steadiness. Someone with less silence. And so you serve the law not out of love nor faith, but out of a kind of haunted necessity. Because you are the line between law and chaos. Because you know too well what happens when no one is willing to hold the axe. There is a difference, though few speak of it, and fewer still care to know, between killing and executing. And though the result is on the surface much the same, a heart that beats no longer, a body that moves no more, the space between them is vast and meaningful, not merely in the eyes of the law or the shape of ritual, but in the very hands that carry it out. For to be an executioner is to dwell in that narrow, silent corridor between violence and duty, between cruelty and craft. And it is in that space, in the weight of that distinction, that you have spent your life. The work demands more than strength. That is the first thing people outside never seem to understand, imagining perhaps that your labor is little more than a downward motion, a swing of arm and blade like chopping firewood or butchering cattle, as if the human neck were made of little more than sinew and will, as if the act itself carried no cost beyond the sharpening of the edge and the wiping of blood. But in truth, it is not muscle that defines your trade. It is precision. You must know the body, how the vertebrae lie, how the tension of fear stiffens the flesh, how a man kneels with resignation or with rage or with trembling knees that might shift at the last moment and ruin the alignment you've measured in your mind a dozen times before stepping forward. You must feel the balance of the weapon, not just hold it, but become part of it, your arms and the blade joined like the limbs of a single creature, whose breath slows at the same rate, whose focus narrows to a single perfect point. One stroke. That is the mark of a good executioner, not because it is cleaner or more honorable, though both are true, but because it is merciful. Because it is your one small rebellion against the spectacle, your only resistance to the notion that death must always be a show. And yet, when it goes wrong, and it has gone wrong more than once, you feel it not only in your arms, but in the marrow of your shame. The blade slips, or the condemned jerks, or the angle is off by a breath, and suddenly the crowd is restless, a murmur rippling through their ranks like wind through dry leaves, and your heart climbs into your throat, not for your own sake, for you are used to their disgust, their judgment, their curses muttered behind closed shutters, but for the man who kneels before you, still alive, still aware, waiting now, not for death, but for the error to be corrected. There was a man once a rebel, they said, or perhaps a bandit, or maybe only a loud drunk who had angered the wrong steward, and the axe did not finish him on the first blow. You remember it, not in flashes of blood, though there was plenty, but in sound, the way the crowd gasped, the way a child whimpered, the way the man made no sound at all, only looked at you wide-eyed and unblinking, as if willing you to make it right. You did. The second stroke was true, but the shame lived longer than the moment. It followed you home. It laced your dreams. Since that day, you test the weight of the axe more often. You check the edge 3 times instead of 2. You stretch your shoulders before walking to the scaffold. And you speak through only in your mind a small, silent plea, not for forgiveness, but for steadiness, for the strength to bring swift endings. Because precision is mercy, but it is also performance, and that too weighs on you. For the executioner does not merely do, he must also be seen doing. And in this, you must become both man and mask, both butcher and priest, both silent instrument and visible embodiment of the state's wrath. You must climb the scaffold with the weight of the crowd's eyes on your shoulders. Each gaze a judgment, not of the condemned, but of you, each whisper a tally of your bearing, your robe, your pace, your posture. Do you look solemn enough? Too solemn? Does your expression suggest pity or disdain or indifference? You learn to wear the same face, always still impassive, focused not on sorrow or justice or spectacle, but on execution as both deed and title. And the tools you use, they are not merely sharp steel and polished wood. They are symbols, and you keep them with reverence, not because you revere death, but because they are the only part of the process you can truly control. You oil the blade not to honor blood, but to resist rust. You hang the rope with care not to make it look theatrical, but to make sure it breaks the neck rather than strangles. You examine the trap door. You weigh the stone. You measure the drop. You take no pleasure in the gallows, but you respect it. For if the rope is too short, the neck does not break and the body kicks. If the knot is tied poorly, the head may slip free. If the trapdoor sticks, the shame is yours. Every hinge matters. Every board must be solid. Every calculation must be made. You do not make mistakes, except when you do. And when you do, you remember. The blade that bit bone instead of neck. The scream that broke through the quiet. The eye that met yours too long before closing. You remember not as a ledger, not as a confession, but as a ledger of responsibility, the weight not of sin, but of precision lost even momentarily. And still you rise the next day. Still you prepare the blade. Still you meet the crowd. Because no one else will. Because you alone understand the cost of getting it wrong. You once heard a physician say that a bad cut could kill a man as surely as poison, and you nodded, not aloud, but inside, because you knew the truth of it, and not just the truth of wound and bleeding, but the deeper truth that there is a kind of cruelty in imprecision, a cruelty that lingers not in the flesh, but in the memory of how it could have gone differently. So you hone the axe. You test the rope. You clean the gear with your own hands. Because if the task must be done, and it always will, then let it be done by hands that know what they're doing. By hands that care even if they cannot show it. By hands that have learned stroke by stroke that precision is not just craft. It is a kind of grace. There are garments you wear only for death, and though they hang on the same iron hook as your daily cloak, and the same wooden peg as your work tunic, they are touched differently, lifted differently, folded, differently handled, not as clothing, but as tools, as relics of a duty that lives half in the world of men and half in something colder, older, and more watching. For the robes of your office are more than mere fabric, more than leather and wool and dark thread. They are the shell of your transformation, the skin you must wear to become not a man, but a function, a force, a symbol in the shape of flesh. There is the hood, of course, most iconic and most misunderstood. A thing that covers not just your features, but your humanity, a veil of anonymity that people think you wear to hide your shame or protect your identity. But in truth, the hood is for them, not for you. It is their comfort, their illusion, their shield against the knowledge that you are not some faceless servant of justice summoned from the shadows, but a man with a voice and a heartbeat, and thoughts that twist behind the cloth like smoke in a lantern. And though some towns dispense with the hood entirely, demanding full visibility, as if that honesty makes the death more pure, you have found that people prefer the mystery, prefer not to know what you look like when you weep in your sleep or count coins with trembling fingers. Then there is the coat, thick leather or coarse wool depending on the season, often dark with age, stained not just from blood, but from time and weather, and long walks back from gallows soaked in rain, or fog, or winter's breath. It is heavy more than it needs to be, and though you could cut it down or patch it thinner, you do not, for the weight is part of the ritual, part of what helps you move with slowness and deliberation. When the moment comes, when the crowd is quiet, and the magistrate's voice fades into the chill of morning, and all that remains is you, your hands, your robe, and the man or woman kneeling with rope-bound wrists at your feet. You put it on in silence, always buttoning the chest with steady fingers, pulling the hood into place with no mirror, because you know exactly how it must fall, how it must drape across your shoulders and shadow your face just so. The ritual of dressing is not just preparation, but transformation, the shedding of the self. You were in your garden, in your sleep, at your fire, and the assumption of the self they need you to become. And they do need you to become it. You have seen the way the crowd responds when you ascend the scaffold, not merely to the sight of you, but to the idea of you cloaked and silent and slow, a walking answer to all their uncertainties, their fears, their rage. They may hate you, they may spit at your feet, or cross themselves when you pass. But in that moment on that stage, they need you to be more than just a man. They need you to be the weight of the law, the hand of order, the unflinching end. They have gathered They have watched the accused, tried or denounced or cursed or condemned, and they need the sentence finished cleanly and unmistakably. And so you carry yourself with a kind of solemn grace that is not for your sake, but for theirs. There is a way to stand, a way to hold the axe, a way to breathe. You learned it from your father who learned it from his father, and so on back through a line not written in books, but carved in memory, handed down not as heritage, but as burden. He taught you to move slowly up the scaffold stairs, not so slowly as to prolong the moment, but slowly enough to give the crowd time to hush, to realize that what they have gathered for is not a spectacle, but a reckoning. He taught you to pause at the top, to scan the crowd, not for faces, but for mood. Were they angry, restless, afraid? Because your movements would need to mirror theirs, not feed the fire, but contain it. He taught you how to speak without speaking, how to nod, how to gesture, how to place a hand on the condemned's shoulder, not gently, but not cruelly, either, just firmly, like an anchor. And he taught you how to carry the axe not low, like a farmer, not slung like a hunter, but upright beside your leg, so that it was always visible, always ready, not flaunted, but declared. These were the rituals, the choreography of justice, and they mattered. Because if you wore the robe too sloppily, they would whisper. If you moved too quickly, they would panic. If you hesitated, they would doubt. And doubt in such moments is dangerous. Not for you who already carries the stain of fear, but for the town, the square, the fragile illusion that order exists and that it can be enforced, that there is a line between sin and punishment, and that someone stands at that line with clean tools and steady hands. So you play your role not because it is a lie, but because it is a story they need told a certain way. And yet, when the robe comes off, when the hood is lifted, the coat unfastened, the leather peeled from your skin like a mask made of memory, you feel the weight of it not leave you, but shift, move inward, settle somewhere behind your ribs, because though the garment can be folded and hung, the role remains clinging to your thoughts and your silences, and the way people step aside when you enter a room. You have burned a robe once. Not this one, but an older one, your father's, after he died. You did it alone behind your house in a pit dug shallow with your own hands. Not because it was filthy or torn, but because it held too much, too many memories, too much grief. You lit it with a taper, watched it curl and darken and turn to ash, and thought not of your father's face, which had grown dim in your memory, but of his hands, the way they had folded the robe each night with care, the way they had buttoned the collar, pulled the hood smooth, and placed the axe on the same wooden shelf where yours now rests. It was a funeral of sorts, not for the man, but for the role he wore. And you wonder some nights if someone will do the same for you, if your robe will be folded or burned, hung or hidden and passed to another, or buried in the earth like a secret no one wants to inherit. You wonder if anyone will remember how you stood, how you moved, how you spoke without speaking, and whether in the end the robe will carry more weight than the man who wore it. It is strange, though, perhaps not entirely surprising, how often the people who fear you most are the very same ones who come earliest on execution day, who find reasons to linger near the square as dawn breaks across the steeples and the market stalls are still unopened, who gather in murmuring clusters at corners and fountains and archways, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, as if to quiet some twitching nervousness within, and who, when the hour approaches, press close enough to the scaffold that their breath fogs in the air, and their eyes gleam with something that is not quite pity, and not quite hate, and not quite mere curiosity, but rather that old, deep, and dangerous hunger that lives in crowds, the hunger not for food or warmth or shelter, but for resolution, for punishment, for the clean moment when guilt is made physical and the sentence passes from idea to flesh. You see it in their posture, in the way they lean forward when the condemned is brought forth, some standing silent and rigid as gravestones, while others whisper to one another, guessing crimes, inventing backstories, declaring judgment, with the confidence of those whose necks are not on the block. And though they may not admit it even to themselves, they have come not for justice, but for satisfaction, for the thrill of order being restored, for the comfort of seeing someone else punished. Someone else brought low, someone else's story closed before theirs is called to account. They will not say this, of course. They will say they came because it is the law, or because it is right to witness, or because their neighbor dragged them along, and they had no choice. But you have seen enough faces to know better, and you have learned to read them the way other men read weather or coin. There is the angry one, jaw clenched, fists tight, who watches not the condemned, but you, waiting for the smallest sign of hesitation or cruelty, ready to spit and shout that the act was unjust, that the blade was too quick or too slow, that your very presence is an affront to decency. There is the fearful one, eyes, wide fingers at their mouth, stepping back with each breath, not afraid of the condemned, but of the moment itself, the finality, the visible reality of death, where they usually keep it buried under bread and gossip. There is the smug one, arms crossed, nodding slightly, who believes this death has made the world safer, better, purer, and who will retell it later with a sense of righteousness so thick it sticks to the back of the throat like syrup. And then, perhaps worst of all, there is the entertained one, the one who watches with a gleam, who smiles faintly when the sentence is read, who leans forward not to understand, but to enjoy, who treats the execution as a kind of theater with you as actor, and the condemned as the final act. You cannot speak to them, you cannot change them, but you feel them always as you walk to the scaffold, as you set your tools, as you lift the blade. You feel their breath in the back of your neck. You feel their need, their anticipation, their fear disguised as authority. And you perform the act not for them, but in spite of them. You do it as cleanly as you can, as swiftly, and with as much grace as the moment allows, not to honor the crowd, but to deny them the chance to see suffering, to rob them of the spectacle they secretly crave, to turn their hunger into silence, even if only for a breath. Because when the execution is done well, when the body falls without a cry, when the crowd does not know whether to gasp or pray, there is a stillness that follows, a strange and holy hush that spreads like smoke between them. And in that hush, for a heartbeat or two, they remember that death is not justice, but consequence, and that what they have witnessed is not glory, but ending. You have learned to cherish that silence, not because it absolves you, not because it justifies the act, but because it means, at least for a moment, the crowd is thinking not of punishment, but of mortality, their own. Still, not all crowds go quiet. Some erupt. You remember the one with the thief who sang as he was brought forth, who smiled at the jeers and threw his final words like stones at the people below, who called out names, who laughed, who spat. They hated him. They screamed for you to hurry, to silence him, to finish it. And you did. But when the blade fell, they cheered. And the sound of that cheer stayed with you longer than the blood, longer than the weight of the axe, longer even than the face of the condemned. Because in that moment, you understood something you wished you hadn't. That some crowds do not want justice, only confirmation that someone else was worse than they are. And you wonder often if the sentence itself matters at all. If the words spoken by the magistrate carry any true weight, or if the crowd would gather just the same without them, if all they need is a man on his knees and another standing above with something sharp. The rituals of law are meant to contain the blood. But the crowd is what spills it, and yet you keep returning, not because you enjoy it, not because you agree with them, but because if you are not there, if someone with care and silence and ritual is not there, then the crowd takes over, and the moment becomes theirs. And then there is no mercy. There is only rage, only spectacle, only the roar of people who have forgotten what it means to watch a life end. So you go again and again to stand between them and the man who must die. You carry your axe not just as blade but as barrier. You wear the hood not to hide but to protect. Not yourself but him, the condemned. Because if the crowd sees your face, they forget his. And sometimes when the sentence is done, and you have washed your hands, and the scaffold is empty, and the people have gone, you return to the square alone just before dusk, when the pigeons are picking at crumbs, and the shadows are long and thin, and you stand where you stood that morning, and you look at the ground, and you listen to the quiet. Because the quiet is the only part that tells the truth. There is a rhythm to endings that you have learned not from any book or sermon or tutor, but from long habit, from repetition, from the feel of iron and rope and timber and steel. And the way they all seem to hum together quietly once the work is done, and the crowd has gone, and the condemned has been buried or carted off, or wrapped in a coarse cloth, and lowered into a pit with no marker, but your memory, a rhythm that begins not with the swing of the blade, but with the silence that follows it. A hush that sits on the scaffold like fog over a pond, soft and undisturbed, and then slowly lifts as your body returns to itself, and the weight in your arms becomes merely wood and iron once more. You always move slowly in these moments, not out of fatigue, though. There is always fatigue heavy as wet wool draped across your bones, but out of something more like reverence or perhaps caution, as though the air itself is brittle and must not be broken too suddenly, as though the echoes of the act have not yet finished resounding in the unseen places, and any sudden movement might call them back again. You wipe the blade with a cloth you carry just for this, folding it twice before setting it aside, not because anyone has told you to, or because any law demands it, but because this too is part of the ritual, and the ritual is all that stands between duty and madness. There are no prayers spoken aloud. You are not a priest, but you have your own rights. You tilt the axe just so to let the sunlight flash along the edge, not as a flourish, not for spectacle, but to be certain that no blood remains hidden in the places where metal meets wood. You touch the ropes, feeling the twist of the fibers between your fingers, testing their strength and balance, not because you must use them again soon, but because in this world, things that go untended fall into rot. You watch the assistants gather the straw and sweep the boards. You nod to the constable. You listen to the murmurs of the bailiff, checking records or coin, or the final words of the sentence. And all the while you do not speak unless spoken to. And even then, your voice comes slowly, as if drawn up from a deep well. And only when the business is finished do you walk back down the steps, never hurried, never stumbling, and begin the long return home. And though the path is the same as it was that morning, it always feels different now, not shorter, not longer, just changed as if the very ground has absorbed what has happened and become something else beneath your feet. You nod to no one, for there is no one to nod to, and you pass windows that close shutters, that twitch, dogs that go silent when you draw near. You walk with the blade wrapped tight, tucked under your arm, like something sacred and dangerous, which in truth it is. Back in your house, your crooked, low-beamed, weather-gnarled house that sits at the edge of town like a forgotten verse in a hymn that no one sings anymore. You light a lamp, not because it is dark, but because the act itself soothes you, the flaring of flame, the little rush of heat, the familiarity of wick and oil and spark. You hang your cloak, unbuckle the leather straps of your apron, and fold them both with slow precision, your fingers moving as though in prayer, not to any saint or holy figure, but to the idea of order, of closure, of something being put back in its place. You wash your hands, always. The basin is chipped and the water cold, but you do not rush it, scrubbing not just for cleanliness, but for certainty, for the knowledge that you are removing the remnants of what has been done not from your conscience, but from your skin. You dry them on a rag that no one else touches, and you hang it by the door to dry where the sun, if it is generous, will reach it by mid-afternoon. There is bread and perhaps some broth left from yesterday, and you eat slowly, not because you are savoring it, but because the act of eating returns you to your body, reminds you that you are still here, still breathing, still flesh and bone and hunger. Sometimes the food tastes of ash, sometimes you taste nothing at all. But you eat all the same because the body must be fed, and because even the most feared hand in the village must move with strength when called. And when the meal is done, you sit, not to rest, though your legs may ache, and your shoulders may be stiff, but to mark the moment when the task is truly behind you, when the day's grim duty is folded away like the robe on its hook, when you can finally allow yourself to let the silence settle and the air return to its natural stillness. It is in this quiet more than any other that your thoughts come. Not loud, not fast, but gently, like leaves drifting down a well. You think of the man's face, not the expression he wore at the end, but the way he held himself as he walked up the scaffold steps, the way his hands trembled or didn't, the way his eyes searched for someone in the crowd who wasn't there. You wonder who he was beyond the scroll and the sentence. You wonder who will remember him, if anyone, and you wonder if it matters. You reach for the small knife on the shelf. Not a weapon, not a tool, just a whittling blade you sometimes use to pass the time, and you turn a scrap of wood in your fingers, shaving off slow curls that fall like feathers to the floor. You do not carve anything in particular. You never do. It is not about the shape. It is about the motion. Outside, the birds have returned to the trees. The square has been swept. The scaffold stays empty and quiet, catching the sun as it sets behind the chapel's spire. And for a little while you allow yourself to breathe without remembering, to sit without carrying, to exist not as a symbol, not as a hand, not as the law made flesh, but simply as a man, alone, quiet, watching the last light fade. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, between breaths, between the weight of what was and what will come again, you let your shoulders drop and your eyes close, because the robe is folded, the tools are at rest, and for tonight, at least, death does not call. You would think, or perhaps others would, that a man whose work is to end life would be shunned entirely, treated not merely with fear or cold civility, but with outright rejection, that he would be left alone in the truest sense of the word, not just in posture and profession, but in spirit and reputation, made a kind of untouchable creature fit only for blood and silence. And yet curiously, even in your solitude, even in your exile from feasts and markets and casual conversation, there is a certain strange reverence that clings to you, not warm, not kindly, but laced through with an old superstition, the sort of belief that runs deeper than doctrine and hides itself in gestures and glances and muttered words, passed between midwives and grandmothers when the priests are not listening. It is not something you invited, and it is certainly not something you believe in. Not exactly. But you cannot deny that it happens, that it has always happened, even to your father and his father before him, whispered of and speculated about, passed down like a legend, tucked beneath layers of dust and fear, that the hands which take life might paradoxically also have the power to preserve it, to drive out illness, to stop the spread of a wasting cough, or a child's fever, to press against a boil or a swelling, and somehow, through the weight of death itself, command the sickness to retreat. They call it the hangman's cure. They never say it aloud in your presence, not directly, but you see it in the way some of them look at your hands, as if trying to imagine whether they might hold something other than the memory of blades and rope. You see it in the way mothers lift their children out of your way in the street, but cross themselves when your shadow passes. And most of all, you see it in the visitors who come after sunset, cloaked and quiet, knocking once on your door, and then stepping back quickly, not as if afraid of you, but afraid of being seen with you. They come not for judgment, nor confession, but for hope. And they never come during the day. It is always under cover of dusk, when the fields have emptied, and the sky has begun to bruise purple and gold, when the house feels even more separate from the village than usual, and the wind carries with it the scent of cooking fires and damp leaves and endings. You hear their knock, low and measured, and you always know what it means. You do not open the door quickly. You let the silence gather, not to frighten them, but to give them a moment to decide whether they truly wish to go through with it. Some leave. You hear their steps retreating, hurried and uneven, and you do not chase them. But others stay. And when you finally open the door, lamp in hand and cloak still about your shoulders, they look at you not as a man, but as a last hope, a shadow that might offer some flicker of light, a cursed thing that might carry within it some crooked blessing. They speak little, sometimes not at all. They show you a wound, a rash, a child with fever-glazed eyes, and you, who are not a healer, who knows only the body as a thing that breaks, not as one that recovers, do what you can. You offer no promises. You press your palm to the brow. You touch the swelling with the back of your hand. You nod, and then they thank you quietly and leave. It is not a miracle. You are not a saint. You do not know whether your touch helps at all. But sometimes days later you hear that the child recovered, that the wound did not turn black, that the fever passed in the night. And though you tell yourself it is coincidence, you cannot help but feel something move inside your chest, something that does not quite rise to the level of hope but sits near it like a weary neighbor who offers no words, only presence. There is a superstition older than most laws that says a hand which has known the warmth of death may frighten sickness into retreat. It is nonsense, surely. And yet, is it? For you have seen the body at its final moment. You have watched the light leave the eyes, the breath vanish, the limbs slacken. And perhaps, just perhaps, something lingers on your skin, not power, not magic, but the memory of that passage, the faintest echo of mortality that clings to your fingertips like the last warmth of a dying fire. You do not tell anyone of this, not because it is a secret, but because there are no words that will carry the right weight. You simply live with it. You accept that in the same town that fears you, there are those who believe in you not as a man, but as a tool of something larger, something beyond justice and punishment. And in this belief, there is something almost like mercy, because it means that death is not the only thing you bring. Because it means that your hands, for all their history, might also be remembered for what they did not destroy. One night, many years ago, a woman came to your door with a boy of perhaps 10, his skin hot, his lips cracked, his eyes dull and sunken. She said nothing, only held him out to you. And you, wordless, took his hand in yours, placed your other on his chest, and sat with him by the hearth, while the flames hissed quietly in the dark. He stared at you with the eyes of someone who had seen things too soon. You did not look away. You gave him broth. You wiped his brow. You stayed until dawn. And then they left. You never saw them again. But months later, a small carved token appeared on your doorstep, a wooden figure crudely shaped but carefully painted of a hooded man holding a child in one arm and an axe in the other. You keep it on your shelf, not because you believe it, but because it believed in you. And that perhaps is enough. So when the knock comes, always after dusk, always cautious, you rise without complaint, because the law demands much of you. But the living ask for something else entirely. And even if your hands carry the weight of death, they may also carry the hope of healing. And that in this quiet house on the edge of all things is the only balance you are allowed to hold. It is not every night they come, not even every week or month, but when they do, you always know before the knock sounds, before the low fist touches wood, before the silence on the path shifts and the world seems to lean in slightly as though listening. You feel it in your chest, in the stillness of the room, in the way the fire burns lower than usual, without sputtering out, in the way the air presses against the shutters, just hard enough to rattle but not to enter, in the way your own hands seem to pause mid-motion, as though remembering something you haven't done yet, but soon will. And so, when the knock finally comes, soft and certain, you are never surprised, only still as if the moment has stepped into the room before the visitor ever does. The ones who come by night are not the same as those who arrive in daylight, not the bailiffs with their scrolls and their stiff voices, not the magistrates who want their justice wrapped in ceremony, not the townsfolk who hurry past you in the market and glance at your boots, but never your face. These visitors are quieter, thinner in voice, more hesitant in step, and always they come with a need that is too large to carry alone and too strange to speak of in any place touched by the sun. Sometimes they come with sickness, of course, the kind that clings to a child's breath or a mother's bones, the kind that no herb or prayer has lifted, and they ask you wordless or whispering to do what cannot be named, to chase the death away by being its brother, to touch with the hands that know endings so that the story might continue. But sometimes rarer and harder they come with a different burden, a kind of shame that does not wear the face of illness, but of guilt of something done or said or thought that cannot be undone, something that has eaten its way into the heart, like rot in the beams of a house. And they do not speak plainly, for what they bring is not confession, not penance, but a desire to be seen by someone who already walks with shadow, who will not flinch or judge or offer platitudes, someone who has known the weight of final moments and who might understand. They do not ask for forgiveness. They ask for silence, and you give it to them. You open the door and let them in, not into your home, not always, but into your presence, into the quiet you carry like a cloak, into the space where no one speaks unless they must, and where a look or a nod or a slow breath is answer enough. There was a man, once a cobbler by trade, quiet, gray-eyed, who came to you in the middle of a hard winter, his cloak thin and patched, his hands red with cold, and he stood on your doorstep without knocking for several minutes, as if the act of being near you might be enough, as if whatever he carried could be lessened simply by standing where the weight of your deeds hung thick in the air. When he did speak, it was only to say that he had struck his daughter not in anger but in panic, in a moment when the fever was high and the child would not stop crying, and something in him snapped, something he didn't know could break, and now she would not look at him, would not speak, and he did not know what to do. He did not ask you to fix it. He only wanted you to know, and you listened. You stood in the doorway with your lamp, and you said nothing. And he cried not loudly, not with drama, but like someone pouring water from a cracked jar, slow and steady and impossible to stop. And when he was done, he wiped his eyes with his sleeve and turned to go. You never saw him again. But the next market day, you noticed that the girl walked beside him again, her hand in his. And you said nothing. because that is what you give them, not answers, not redemption, but space. And it is a kind of healing too, not of the body, but of the soul. There are those who cannot go to priests. Their sins are not the kind that wear names easily. They do not wish for sermons. They wish only for someone who understands that human hands are sometimes weak, that even the gentlest soul can be made cruel by fear, by hunger, by grief. And you who have watched strong men tremble, who have listened to the last words of dozens who have seen death in every mood and posture, know that weakness is not always sin. Sometimes it is simply the cost of being alive. And so they come to you, these visitors of the night, and they do not stay long, and you do not ask them why. You offer them water or a place by the fire, and you let them speak or remain silent. And when they leave, you do not follow them with questions or prayers. You simply close the door and sit in the quiet they leave behind. Because their sorrow adds to yours, but it also shapes it. It reminds you that you are not the only one carrying stories that cannot be told in daylight. And in some strange, silent way, it makes your solitude feel less like a punishment and more like a service. You have never written any of this down. No ledger records the cobbler, or the mother, or the young boy who came with a tooth wrapped in cloth and asked if you could stop the pain. But you remember them. Not their names, not always, but their faces, their voices, the weight they carried when they knocked. And you know that when you are gone, no one will remember them the way you do. No one will recall the way the wind blew through the eaves the night the old weaver came and confessed that she had lied about her sister's son, or the way the innkeeper's wife held your hand for just a moment, wide, with something like gratitude before she disappeared into the dark. You are the witness they could not find elsewhere. And even if the world calls you cruel, even if the church shuns you, and the town looks away, you know that in those quiet hours, by the glow of the hearth and the flicker of the lantern, you gave something rare and needed. Not judgment, not justice, but stillness. A place where sorrow could rest, even if only for a moment. There are bodies that no one will claim, and names that no lips dare speak again, people who fall not only out of life, but out of memory itself, as though the act of execution has not merely removed breath from their lungs, but swept away every trace of their place in the world. No grave dug, no prayer spoken, no hand reached out in parting. And when such deaths occur as they do from time to time, when the condemned has no kin willing to be seen at the gallows, or has been declared so foul that the churchyard will not take him, or has died in silence and fear and rage alone and unblessed, it falls to you to do what no one else will, to carry. Not only the axe, but the spade, not only the rope, but the shovel, to return not only justice, but the dead to the earth itself. And it is in these moments, under a sky emptied of stars, and a wind that seems to draw the breath from your own mouth, that the full weight of your task reveals itself not in the clang of the blade or the hush of the crowd, but in the deep, steady scrape of earth against metal, as you dig a grave for someone who may have deserved death, but does not deserve to vanish, from a woman whose wrongs may have been many, but who now at last lies still and cold like any other. No different in form from a priest or a thief, just a body, slack and silent, waiting to be covered. There is no ceremony for these burials, no procession, no mourners, no tolling bell, only you and the dark and the weight of the corpse bundled in rough cloth, or nothing at all. And sometimes you do not even have a cart to wheel them down to the far fields, just your arms and your back, and a long, lonely walk to a patch of ground where the soil is loose and the trees grow crooked, and even the crows keep their distance, and there you kneel and do what needs doing. You have become in those hours not executioner, but grave digger, not enforcer of law, but custodian of silence, And though no one thanks you for it, and no one will remember it, there is something in the act that steadies your heart, that reminds you that no matter the crime, or the sentence, or the scorn that clings to the name of the dead, a body must be returned to the ground, because the earth, at least, does not discriminate. It does not care who you were. It does not ask what you did. It only accepts quietly and completely, as if to say, enough. There was a woman once young, or so she seemed, though hard living, and harder eyes made her face unreadable, who had taken a knife to her master, a merchant of some wealth and no reputation for mercy, and whether it was vengeance or self-defense or some deeper fury, no one cared to understand. She was condemned quickly and without trial, and no one came to speak on her behalf, no brother, no lover, no friend. And when the rope was cut, and her body swung limp, not a single person stepped forward. The priest refused her the rites. The townsfolk crossed themselves and went home. And so it was you under a sky that bled into gray, who lifted her down from the gallows alone and carried her to the field beyond the bramble path, where the ground was soft enough to take the shape of her once more. And you dug with slow hands, not because you pitied her, though you may have, but because the task itself demanded care, and because no one should be left to rot above ground. You placed a stone. You said no words. You did not need to. There are men the church forbids to be buried on holy ground. Heretics, suicides, traitors, and though you do not dispute the law, you do not always obey it in spirit, for when the sentence is carried out, and the crowd has left, and the parchment has been signed, the body is no longer a symbol, no longer a warning, no longer a message to the town. It is just a shell, cold and still and waiting, and someone must carry it, and someone must dig the hole, and someone must cover it over, and if that task has always fallen to you, then so be it. You have made a kind of map in your mind, a secret one of the graves you have dug in silence, each marked by a tree or a rock or a twisted root, not because you fear forgetting, but because remembering seems like the only gift you can give, a small defiance against the tide of disappearance, a way of saying you were here even if the world no longer says your name. There are times rare but real, when someone does come long after the sister who was too afraid to show her face, the lover who could not speak until the magistrate had gone, the mother who still dreams of her child. And they find you somehow and ask, voice low and tight with grief, where did you bury them? And you lead them. Quietly. No words. You walk the crooked path. You point to the stone, and you step back. Because grief is not yours to share, only to make space for. There are days when the dead outnumber the living in your memory. Not because you are haunted, but because you remember what others will not. Not their sins, but their stillness, their weight, the shape of their limbs as you laid them down. There are no headstones, no dates, but you remember. You remember the man who kissed the ground before he climbed the scaffold. The woman who asked you to hum something, anything, so she wouldn't die in silence. The boy who handed you a coin and asked you to give it to his mother, though he did not know if she still lived. You remember them not because you choose to, but because the work chooses you, again and again and again. And when the field is still, and the grave filled, and the earth patted flat and cool and anonymous once more, you stand for a moment, not long, just enough, and then you turn back toward the village. The path winds through thickets and thorns, and your boots carry the dirt of death back to the doorstep no one wants to cross. You clean your hands, you hang your coat, you place the spade back where it belongs beside the axe. And you sit in the silence waiting for the next knock, or the next name, or the next task that no one else will do. Because you are not only the one who ends life, you are also the one who carries what remains, And in this, as in everything, you are alone, but not entirely unneeded. There are laws that govern the land written in Latin and sealed in wax signed by magistrates, whose hands smell of ink and old wool, and spoken aloud in solemn voices in the town square, where the people gather with hunched shoulders and weary eyes to hear what punishment has been deemed fitting for what transgression. But there are other laws, too older and unwritten laws, that move beneath the surface of things like water under a frozen lake, not spoken but understood, not taught but inherited. And you, though you were never handed a scroll or led before an altar, have come to know these laws better than most, for they are the ones that bind you, not in chains of iron or rope, but in customs and fears and the quiet, creeping weight of what is not allowed to be named. They are not the laws of kingdoms, but of kitchens and alleys of gossip, and gesture of who may sit where at the feast, and who must leave before the candles are lit. And they wrap themselves around you like invisible cords, delicate, yet unbreakable, shaping the edges of your life in 100 small ways, until you realize one day that you have been marked not by sin or crime, but by proximity to it, that simply by holding the axe, by tying the knot, by standing on the scaffold, as the bell tolls, you have been placed forever at the edge of the fire. Not burned, perhaps, but never truly warm. There are towns where you are not permitted to eat in the inn, not because the law forbids it, but because the innkeeper has decided quietly and without explanation that his chairs would buckle under your weight, or that your coin carries some hidden stain, and so you take your meals at home alone, not with bitterness, not even with surprise, but with the kind of resignation that feels more like habit than injustice. There are villages where no daughter will be allowed to marry your son, no matter how kind his eyes or how steady his hands. Because a man who buries the dead and breaks the necks of the condemned is thought to carry something within him, something heavy and invisible and inescapable, and that whatever seed he plants will grow crooked. There are places where your house must be built at the edge of the boundary stones, not within the circle of hearth and well and steeple, but beyond the last gate near the fields where the birds cry louder and the wind cuts sharper. And though no one says this aloud, everyone understands why. Because even as they depend on you, they cannot bring themselves to live beside you. And so you live apart. Not punished, but placed. You are not jailed. You are not chained. You are simply othered. Even when you walk among them, even when you shop for bread, even when you bow your head during Mass, there is always a space between. It is there in the way the baker lays your loaf on the counter rather than placing it in your hand. It is there in the way the children are pulled gently aside when you pass by. It is there in the way your name is said only when necessary, and never with ease. Once long ago, you were invited to a wedding feast. You had helped the family before, in some small and quiet way. Perhaps you had cured a rash or buried a cousin. No priest would claim, and they wanted to show you kindness. You arrived late wearing your cleanest tunic, your boots scrubbed of mud, and you stood at the edge of the hall, smiling faintly, watching the lights and the laughter, and the way the wine caught the candlelight like melted gold. But when you stepped forward, plates shifted and conversations faltered, and though no one told you to leave, they did not need to. You left without speaking, and the family never mentioned it again. You learned in that moment something deeper than rejection. You learned what it means to be tolerated, and yet you carry no hatred. That too is something you inherited from your father, who told you once that to grow bitter is to rot from the inside, that the axe does not cut more cleanly when wielded in anger, and that the silence of the condemned is not so different from the silence of the crowd. So you bear it. You accept the rules. You obey the hidden laws. You live where they allow you to live. You eat when no one is looking. You bury your dead at night beneath trees no church will bless. And you teach your son, if you have one, to do the same, to nod, to wait, to endure. Because the work does not make you holy or wicked or special. It simply makes you visible, and that is enough to separate you from the rest. You are not feared because you kill. You are feared because you are close to death, because you understand something that others do not. And that understanding unsettles them. So they wrap you in silence. They keep you at the edge. And in time you come to prefer it. You find comfort in the distance. You learn the rhythm of the margins. You walk the fence lines, not the courtyards. You speak with trees, not crowds. You know the names of birds, not bakers. And you live a life that, though small and quiet and often cold, is true. Because there is no pretense in your solitude, no lie in your stillness. Only the steady presence of a man who has accepted the place the world has made for him. And in that acceptance there is peace. Not joy, not ease, but peace. Because you know who you are, and more importantly, who you are not. And though the world may never welcome you fully, it will always, always need you. There is a question that hangs over every act you perform, a question that sits just out of reach, quiet, but present like smoke that curls beneath the doorframe, or a draft that slips through the seam in the shutter. Not because it is whispered by the magistrate, or written in the scroll, or murmured by the onlookers behind their scarves and their judgment, but because it lives inside you, behind the steadiness of your step and the calm of your eyes. A question that you could ask, but never do, not aloud, not even to yourself in the silence of your home. And yet it lingers, it waits, it breathes with you. And though it never takes full shape, its shadow is unmistakable. Were they guilty? You are not a judge. You are not a priest. You are not a man of words or law or interpretation. You are the hand that delivers the sentence, not the voice that declares it. But even so, you cannot help on certain mornings, when the air is clear and your blade is sharp, and the condemned looks at you not with rage or resignation, but with a kind of naked bewilderment, as if they themselves are not entirely certain why they stand upon the scaffold. On those mornings you cannot help but feel the shape of the question, rising like a tide beneath the boards. There are days when the guilt is plain painted in blood, and cruelty shouted from the mouths of witnesses, carved into the skin of the victim. And on those days your blade feels steady. But there are other days, many more than you would admit, when the tale is murky, when the magistrate seems nervous, when the scroll is thinner than usual, when the condemned swears innocence not with desperation, but with a strange and quiet dignity, and the townsfolk shift their eyes and fidget, not with the thrill of justice served, but with the unease of something unresolved, and you standing behind the hood feel something cold and slow turn in your chest. You are not permitted to question. That is the rule. The sentence has been passed. The rope is tied. Your task is only to ensure that it is done swiftly, cleanly, and with as much mercy as the method allows. But still, the question curls in the air. Were they guilty? And what if they were not? What if you have sent a soul into the dark who did not deserve it? What if the man who stood before you was not a murderer, but a scapegoat? What if the woman who met your eyes before the blade fell had done no more than speak too boldly, too cleverly, too freely? You do not let the thought live long. It is not safe. To ask is to open the door, and behind that door is not an answer, but a flood. Because if even one was innocent, then what does that make you? You were trained not to flinch, not in your hand, not in your heart. Your father told you that doubt is heavier than steel, that once it sits on your shoulder, it cannot be thrown off, only carried. He taught you to read the scroll, to test the blade, to bind the wrist, to speak the final words when required. But he never told you what to do with the silence afterward, the silence inside. So you learned to turn the question away, to step back from the scaffold and focus on the wood, the hinges, the weight of the rope, the creak of the stairs. You trained your mind to see only the ritual, only the shape, only the task. And it works. Most days. Most. But every now and then it returns. You dream of a man with no face who asks you why. You dream of a girl who stands beneath the gallows, not in fear, but in confusion, her voice like birdsong saying, "I didn't." You wake with the taste of iron on your tongue. You stare at your hands in the dark, and you do not answer, because there is no answer that brings peace. There was a man, a quiet man, older than you, by many years, whose crime was never spoken aloud. You received the scroll with the time and the place and the name, but no detail. The magistrate avoided your eye. The bailiff looked uncomfortable. The man walked calmly to the block and thanked you softly before he knelt. And as your blade rose, you hesitated not long enough for anyone to see, but long enough for you to know. That moment lives in your body. It's in your shoulders, in your wrists, in the way your breath catches sometimes when you oil the steel. You tell yourself it was done rightly. You remind yourself that you do not decide. But the question remains. A quiet guest at the edge of every meal, a shadow in the corner of every room. Were they guilty? You do not answer. You do not ask. You clean the blade. You wash your hands. You sweep the scaffold, and you walk home. Because you must. Because if you stop, the work falls to someone else. And what if they ask the question aloud? What if they hesitate longer? What if the crowd sees no? You keep the question close and silent. You never speak it, because your job is not to know, only to end and to remember, not who they were, not what they did, but the sound of the silence after the fall. It was bound to happen eventually, though you had never let the thought form clearly in your mind, never allowed it to stretch out into full possibility, never given it voice, not even in your private hours. By the fire, when the house is so quiet, you can hear your own breath coming and going, like the tide against a cliff, because to name it would be to admit that the line between you and the condemned is as thin as the blade you carry, and once crossed it cannot be undone. It can only be followed to its end. And so when it did happen, when they brought you the name and you unrolled the scroll and saw the shape of the letters, not just familiar, but known deeply and absolutely, like a voice from your own childhood echoing through stone corridors. You did not move, not at first, just stood with the parchment in your hand and your eyes fixed on it, as if by refusing to blink you might hold time in place. You knew him, not just in passing, not just as a man who once bought you a drink or shared a word at market, but as a friend, or as close to one as a man like you is ever allowed. His name came up slowly in your mind, syllable by syllable, like something being drawn from deep water, and along with it came a flood of small, inconsequential memories that struck you harder than any axe blow ever could. The way he once wrapped a cut finger in a square of linen, torn from his own shirt. The time he laughed so hard at your dry remark that he dropped a sack of onions and they rolled into the street. The fact that he never looked away from you, not even when others crossed the road. And now he was to die. By your hand. The crime, you read it 3 times, then again. Theft and murder. A brawl gone wrong, they said. A man dead in the gutter. a witness uncertain, a trial rushed, and you, his friend, his quiet, secret friend, were to be the one to carry it out. The scroll did not shake in your hand. Your heart did not race. You were past such things. But something inside you, something that had been still for a long time, shifted. You spent the night before the execution cleaning your blade with care, so meticulous, it bordered on madness, rubbing the cloth in tight circles again and again, long after the metal gleamed. Not because it needed it, but because your hands had to be busy, because your mind, given any stillness, wandered to the shape of his face, the sound of his voice, the feel of his presence in the world. You did not sleep. You did not eat. You sat at the table long after the fire had died, and the coals had gone gray, listening to the wind and waiting for morning. When the hour came, you dressed as always, slowly with purpose, pulling the leather over your shoulders, buckling each strap, tying the cords, with hands that did not tremble, and yet every motion felt heavier than usual, as though the very weight of cloth and hide and ritual had doubled overnight. You walked to the square without speaking. The guards met you as they always did. The scaffold was ready, the rope tested. The crowd had gathered as they always gathered, and you stood before them beneath a pale sun and wondered just for a moment if anyone there knew, truly knew what this was, what it cost, what it meant. And then the guards brought him out. He walked like a man who had expected this, not proudly, not fearfully, just knowingly. And when he saw you, he did not flinch. He looked straight at you, not in shock, not in pleading, but in recognition. There you are, he seemed to say. So it's you then. You nodded just once. You did not speak. There was nothing to say. And yet in that moment something passed between you, not forgiveness, not blame, but a kind of acknowledgement, the way soldiers nod to one another before the charge, the way animals meet eyes before they fight or flee. The sentence was read. You did not hear it. You were listening to his breath, watching the tilt of his shoulders, memorizing the way the light caught in his hair, knowing that in moments he would be still forever. He did not resist. He knelt without being asked. And when you stepped forward, he turned his head slightly and said, "Thank you. Only that. Thank you." For what? For being there, for doing it cleanly, for not flinching. You will never know. And yet it broke something in you. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a hairline crack in stone that slowly deepens, widens, hollows out the center, until all that remains is dust in the shape of what used to be whole. You raised the axe, and you did what you have always done. One stroke, no mistake, clean. And when it was over, when the body was lifted and the square began to empty, you did not move, not for a long time. The guards waited, the constable watched, and still you stood, staring at the wood, at the rope, at the blood. Not weeping, not trembling, just standing. Because something in you had changed, not in your hands, but in your understanding. Until that day, you had always thought that the hardest part of the work was the death itself, the moment of ending the act of severing a soul from the world. But now you saw that the true weight was carried in the moments after, when the face you knew no longer spoke, when the name you once laughed with became another notch in the unspoken ledger of your memory. That night, you buried him yourself. They had offered someone else, a clerk or a gravedigger from the outskirts, but you refused. You carried his body out of the town alone. You dug the hole with your own hands. You placed a stone. And when the work was done, you sat beside the grave until the moon passed overhead and the cold bit deep into your skin, and still you stayed. You said nothing. There was nothing to say. Because now you knew that it is not death that haunts you. It is memory. It is friendship turned to ritual. It is the quiet voice saying thank you just before the end, and the knowledge that there will be more. And one day, perhaps it will be someone else you knew, or worse, someone who knew you. It is one of the quiet ironies of your work, one that would make you smile if smiling were not something that you left behind long ago, like a childhood toy or a worn-out coat, that although the condemned kneels before you, and the blade waits behind your back, and the sentence written and sealed and spoken is directed at the one whose neck meets the block. It is the crowd, those hundreds of restless eyes and folded arms and shifting feet and breath, held tight in dozens of throats, that you must attend to most carefully. For their mood is a living thing, volatile and collective, like a field of dry wheat in the wind, ready to sway, to lean, to catch fire, if the spark falls wrongly, and you more than any priest or scribe or constable must know how to read them, not with words, not with questions, but with a glance, with the tilt of their heads, with the way they fold their hands or do not, with the direction they lean as the condemned is led forward, whether toward him or away, with the silence they hold, or the noise they make, with the nature of that noise, laughter, jeering, muttering, gasping, praying, and above all, with the feeling that lives under their skin and rises in their collective breath like a scent. The wind carries thick and unmistakable fear or hunger or fury or awe. And though no one has ever taught you this, there is no manual, no chart, no lecture from your father about how to stand before a throng of eyes and know which way their hearts will turn. You have learned it with the same slow and tireless discipline that taught you to oil your blade and tie your ropes and hold your posture steady even when the sky roars with thunder or the condemned starts to sob, because knowing the crowd is the difference between a clean act and a chaos that cannot be reversed, between order and riot, between being the hand of the law and being its scapegoat when the wind changes and the mood breaks and the people decide without warning or logic that they will not be fed by this death or that they must be fed more. There are mornings when you step into the square and the crowd is heavy with silence, not the holy kind that settles in churches when candles are lit and prayers whispered, but the brittle, jagged silence of something holding back a scream. And you know before the bell tolls, before the sentence is read, that today the danger is not in the swing of your axe, but in the tilt of a head from the front row, or a stone loosed from a pocket, or a shout that turns the tide from solemnity to spectacle. And on such days, you breathe deeply and walk more slowly than usual, letting your body speak in calm lines, letting your steps say what your tongue never will. This is not vengeance, this is process. This is not fury, this is form. And there are other days, days when the sun is high and hot, and the mood is restless, when the villagers have come not out of duty or grief, but out of boredom or hunger, or the cruel pleasure of seeing someone else fall, that the square feels less like a place of justice and more like a theater, and you, the lead player upon the scaffold stage with the crowd, as both chorus and judge, eager not for truth, but for blood, for speed, for a misstep that might turn the ritual into sport. And on such days, your task becomes not just to end the life before you, but to keep the crowd from forgetting that this is death, not drama, that the blade you hold is not a toy, and the man who kneels is not a villain in a tale, but a soul passing through his final hour. And you must carry yourself with such control, such gravity, that even the most eager tongue falls still in the face of your silence. It is not always possible. You have seen it fail. You have watched the mood sour and rise and boil over. You have seen fists raised You have seen guards overwhelmed. You have heard your own name shouted not in command, but in hatred. And you have had to stand there, blade still slick robe, still heavy as the crowd turned from witnesses to accusers, forgetting the sentence they came to see and remembering only the man who carried it out. There was a day years ago, but sharp still in your mind, like the edge of a broken tool when a woman was brought for execution, accused of witchcraft, of curses and herbs, and the death of a merchant's son. And though the case was weak and the proof thinner than mist, the town was afraid, and fear once fed does not fade quickly. And when you stepped onto the scaffold, the air felt wrong, too charged, too loud. And by the time the woman had been tied to the post and the flame lit at her feet, the crowd was no longer watching justice. They were consuming it like wolves at a carcass, their mouths open, their eyes shining. And when the scream rose, hers, yours, it did not matter. They howled in return. That night you drank too much. You scrubbed the ashes from your hands until they bled. You buried your robe in the earth behind your house. You dug it up 2 days later. Because the work must continue. Because someone must do it. But from that day forward, you never trusted a crowd again. You do not look for sympathy in their eyes. You do not hope for understanding. You watch them like you would a field before lightning, and you speak to them not with words, but with pace, with posture, with the slow raising of the blade, with the clean motion of the cut, with the refusal to flinch or falter, or turn the act into a show. And if after the deed is done they cheer because they sometimes do, or boo or scatter in murmuring confusion, you do not stay to listen. You descend the scaffold. You clean your hands. You walk home. Because the crowd is not your audience. They are the sea you cross to do your work. They are the wind that presses against your back. They are the weather you endure. But they do not know you. They never have. And they never will. In a world where gold is hoarded like breath by the powerful and silver moves only through the hands of those who count the cost of every word spoken and every deed performed, who stand so near to death, who carry its instruments in silence and who walk its road alone are often paid not in coin, but in things more tangible and yet somehow far more fleeting behind. Bread rags cloth the boots of the condemned, or the knife taken from his belt, a hen with mottled feathers, or a jug of lamp oil, sometimes a bolt of rough linen, or the torn tunic of the one who knelt. And you take these offerings not with pride, not with resentment, but with the same quiet acceptance with which you take each name handed to you, knowing that your labor, though feared and necessary, does not sit comfortably within the tidy systems of wage and trade, that yours is a service both too clean and too ugly to be bought at market price. There are laws, of course, or rather customs so old they pretend to be laws, that say an executioner is entitled to the clothes of the dead, to the cord that bound them, to the coin they carried in their pocket on the last morning of their life. And while the richer towns might press a small purse into your palm at the end of a hanging, saying little looking away, hoping the weight of the silver would silence what cannot be named, the poorer villages, and they are many, simply give what they have what they can, and though they may flinch as they hand it to you, they do so with the relief of a debt settled, of a burden passed on. You have come home with chickens squawking under your arm, with cheeses wrapped in leaves, with a pair of boots too large, and a leather belt that once held a dagger with a necklace of glass beads, too delicate for your hands, with a carved bone whistle, with a pouch of tobacco or a single pewter spoon. And while others might call this pitiful, you understand it for what it is, not insult, not indifference, but a kind of confused gratitude, the villagers' way of saying, "We see you," even if they never look you in the eye. You remember with a clarity that no number of years has dulled, the first time you were paid in wine, a tall flask sealed with wax, handed to you by the widow of the condemned, who did not speak, and whose face gave nothing away, but who held the vessel with both hands. And when you reached to take it, her fingers brushed yours, cold and calloused. And in that brief touch, there was a tremor that did not belong to fear, but to something else, something older, something that spoke of duty met and sorrow contained, and a kind of dark understanding passed wordlessly between those who have both lost something they cannot name. You drank that wine alone by the fire, and though it was bitter, you drank it slowly, not for comfort, but for remembrance. And you have worn the coat of a thief, patched and stained on cold mornings when your own cloak was damp. You have eaten the bread left behind by a poacher, whose last words were a blessing, or perhaps a curse it was hard to tell through the spitting snow. You have repaired the shoes of a man who claimed innocence until the moment he knelt. You have used the coin that once sat beneath a traitor's tongue to buy flour from a boy who did not know its origin. And each item, however small, however odd, becomes part of your life, not as property, but as presence, as a reminder that your hands, though they end lives, are still bound to the world of the living by these threads of barter, these whispered exchanges of use for use, blood for bread, silence for cloth. There was a day, a bright one, unusually warm, when the payment for your work was not offered at all, and you returned home unsure whether the omission shown was an oversight or a deliberate slight. And though pride is not a garment you often wear, you felt it rise within you like a splinter beneath the nail, sharp and small and persistent. Not because you hungered for coin, but because the absence of anything made the work feel like a theft, like a thing taken without acknowledgement. And you sat for a long time beside your hearth that night, watching the flames and thinking not of the man you had ended, but of the absence he left behind, of the way his death seemed to ripple outward into a silence that offered no answer. But the next morning a basket was found at your door, apples, hard bread, a sprig of rosemary, and a single glove, child-sized, stitched with care. No note, no name, but you knew, and that was enough. Because even though your work is final, even though it ends, what cannot be reversed, there is something in the act of payment. Even payment made in hens and soup bones and borrowed coats that returns the work to the world, that acknowledges its cost, that answers your silence with another kind of silence, the kind that says, yes, it was done. Yes, it was needed. Yes, we are still here. You do not ask for more. You never have. You do not haggle, you do not demand. You take what is given. You nod. You walk home. Because in a world where justice is handed down like thunder and carried out like rain, your reward was never meant to be glory or gold, but continuity, the ability to do the task again and again and again, and to return each time to your threshold, open the door, place the bundle down, and eat whatever the condemned left behind. Because even death must be fed, and you are its steward. And you have learned that a bowl of soup and a strip of wool can mean more than coin ever will, because they come not from law, but from life. And life, however fleeting, is the only payment worth accepting. There are the executions performed in the square with the bell tolling, and the magistrate's voice echoing off stone walls, and the townsfolk clustered in solemn, or at times unsettlingly eager gatherings. But then there are the others, the ones that do not come with scrolls or priests or public rituals. The ones that take place not in view of chapels, steeples, and market stalls, but in tents and trenches and fields littered with banners that no longer matter, and boots that no longer march, in the quiet horror of a battlefield, after the shouting has stopped, and the crows have returned when justice no longer dresses itself in ceremony, but in mud and smoke and silence. And it is there, in those sodden and uncertain places, that your role becomes something else, something darker, more necessary and less defined. For when the wars come, and they always do, creeping across the land. Like a sickness no herb can cure. It is not long before someone remembers you, not as a man, not even as an executioner, in the strict sense, but as a presence, a certainty, a solution to problems no one wishes to carry. And soon enough a rider comes down the road, with a letter or a command, or simply a name and a nod, and you are summoned not to a courtroom or a gallows, but to a camp hastily assembled with stakes and smoke, and the stink of sweat and steel, where soldiers sleep in shifts, and captains argue over maps with lines that move each day, like streams seeking new paths through the hills. And though you have no uniform, no rank, and no allegiance beyond the task itself, you are welcomed grudgingly, warily, but with understanding, because they know that when the time comes to deal with the looters, the deserters, the rapists, the spies, the soldiers who killed their own officers or fled in the dark or burned a barn with innocents inside, they will not want to do it themselves. Because the sword that defends a cause is always easier to raise than the hand that punishes the man who carried it too far. So they send for you, and you come. Not because you believe in their cause or their banners or their anthems, but because the work has no flag, no side, only a need. In the war camps there are no scaffolds, no gallows, no platforms neatly scrubbed. There is rope strung between trees. There are stakes driven into damp soil. There are wooden blocks hastily shaped from firewood and axes borrowed from cooks, and holes dug behind the latrines. Sometimes you are given a sword heavy and broad and chipped at the edge, not fit for ceremony, but sharp enough for death. Sometimes it is simply a dagger and a command, and you do it. You do it because you know how. You do it because they do not. You do it because someone must. The men who die in these camps are not announced to crowds. There is no parchment, no reading of names. They are brought to you by guards who have already decided they deserve to die, and your job is to make the moment real, to carve finality into flesh, to remind the others watching, because there are always others watching, that the war may forgive mistakes, but never disobedience. And in those moments, you find yourself changed, not fully, not forever, but undeniably shifted, because there is no ritual here, no rhythm, only reaction. And though you strive still for precision, for quiet dignity, for the small mercies that make your work bearable, you are surrounded by men who want not solemnity, but speed, not mercy, but message. You become for a time not a guardian of law, but a weapon of order. You remember a boy, he could not have been more than 16, with hands that had never held a plow, let alone a sword, accused of stealing bread from a supply tent during a siege that left the whole camp gnawing on shoe leather and boiled roots, and when they brought him to you, he was crying. Not loud, but slow and hopeless, as if the sobs were leaking from a place too deep to reach. And the captain barked that you should make it quick. And when you raised the blade, he looked up at you, not with hatred or fear, but with something that resembled apology. And you never forgot the shape of his mouth as he whispered, "I was hungry." You buried him yourself. You marked the place with a stone. You do not know his name, but you remember the voice. And so the war leaves its mark, not in wounds, though you bear a few, nor in glory of which there is none, but in the way it changes the weight of your work. How it strips away the layers of ritual and robe and replaces them with immediacy. How it teaches you to kill, not because the town has called for it, but because the camp cannot afford not to, and how afterward, when the flags are lowered, and the fires go out, and the wounded are left to moan into the dusk, you sit alone near the perimeter, sharpening your blade as always, but with hands that no longer know what peace feels like. Because even when the war ends, it does not leave you. It follows you home, in the faces of the men you saw die, in the sound of boots crunching on gravel, in the smell of burnt cloth and blood mingling in your nostrils, in the way you still scan the tree line for movement, for danger. Even as you return to your house at the village's edge, and the crows lift from the chimney, as if greeting an old friend. And though the villagers may never know where you went or what you did, they sense the difference. They see it in your walk, more weighted now. They hear it in your silence, deeper still. They feel it when you pass, that you have stood not just at the edge of death, but in its furnace. And the axe, when you pick it up again, feels both heavier and lighter, as though it remembers the roughness of war and resents being asked to perform with elegance once more. But you clean it just the same. You oil the blade. You fold the robe. You wait. Because whether in the town square or the battlefield ditch, the task returns. And so do you. Because war, like justice, never truly ends. It only changes its costume. And you always waiting in the wings are called when the curtain rises. There are nights, and they have become more frequent of late, when you dream not of blood or blades, or the trembling silence that comes just before the rope tightens, not of names or faces, or the crowd's breath fogging in the cold, not even of the scaffold, or the clatter of boots on its steps, or the flinch of the condemned as the sentence is read. But instead of a door, simple wooden, unadorned with an iron latch, worn smooth by hands, you do not recognize standing at the end of a narrow path that winds through trees you have never seen. In waking life, a path soft underfoot, with leaves that do not fall. And though in the dream you never open this door, never push against the grain or lift the latch, or see what lies behind it, still you wake with the shape of it lodged behind your eyes, like a splinter in the soul. And for a few breathless moments, you wonder with a heaviness that feels like hope, whether the door is real. And you do not speak of this, not even to yourself, not even in the quiet of the house where your only witness is the creak of the roof beam and the soft scratch of a mouse against the stone, but still, the door remains, returning again and again like a tide that pulls the same piece of driftwood into the shallows each night. And though you do not know where the path begins, or where the dream ends, it has begun to seem to you like a kind of invitation, not from the world of men, certainly, which offers you only distance and necessity, nor from the church, which has never looked kindly on those whose hands are soaked with sanctioned sin, but from something older, something patient, and watching something that waits without judgment at the edge of things, and understands, perhaps, what it is to stand always in the role of the ender, the unwelcomed, the necessary shadow. You think sometimes that if you could reach that door, truly reach it in flesh, and not just in dream, you would not knock, nor pause, nor hesitate, but simply step through, and you do not even need to know what lies on the other side. Whether it is a clearing, a fire, a hand outstretched, or only more quiet, more dark, more waiting, because the dream itself has taught you that the opening is enough. The crossing itself is the answer. The choosing to go rather than always to stay, and this thought, it lingers, it thickens like smoke in your lungs during the day when your robe is heavy and your arms ache from the weight of justice, and the scrolls keep coming like winter storms across the valley. And you find yourself just for a moment standing outside your home with your hand on the latch, not of the dream door, but of your own door, the one that creaks when you open it. The one that swings wide onto the little crooked road, where no one walks but you. And you wonder what would happen if you simply kept walking, kept moving past the hedge, past the fields, past the last tree where you buried the nameless man who tried to smile before you dropped the blade, past the village and its boundaries, and its invisible chain of custom and need and fear, until the path beneath your feet became strange. Again became yours again, became something unknown. But you never do. Not because you are afraid, and not because you are proud, but because the door, as much as it calls to you, is a dream, and the world you wake into each morning with its grim demands and worn routines does not tolerate the sudden absence of the one who carries the axe, who ties the knots, who digs the graves that no priest will sanctify. And so you stay again and again each morning, placing your feet on the same floorboards, tying the same leather thongs across your chest, lifting the same tools, and stepping out into a world that does not thank you, but always notices when you are not there. And perhaps that is the truest curse of your trade, not the blood, not the solitude, not even the silence that blooms in the space where friendship and love should grow, but the knowledge that you are needed not once or occasionally, but always as constant as hunger, as inevitable as decay. And that to leave would not be abandonment of your task, but betrayal of the strange unspoken covenant between you and the village, between you and the scaffold, between you and the law itself, which speaks through many voices, but acts only through your hands. Still the dream persists, still the door waits, and on the rare nights when your sleep is deep and undisturbed, when no wind moans at the shutters and no new scroll has arrived by lantern light, you find yourself once again on that path. Your steps lighter than they are, and in waking your robe left behind, your hands clean, and the door, always the door, standing just a few paces ahead, bathed in a light that is not fire and not dawn and not moon, but something all its own, something that feels not like forgiveness or reward or peace, but like release, as though the world at last were willing to let you go. You never reach it. You never touch the latch. You never step across the threshold. But you wake with the image burned into you like a brand. And for a little while, as you rise and light the taper and oil the blade and ready the tools, there is something in you that feels not lighter exactly, but less burdened, as if the dream had taken some small weight from your chest and placed it behind that door to be picked up later, or perhaps never again. You do not know what it means. You do not ask. You simply dream. You simply wake. You simply work. Because until that door opens in this world or the next, you are still the one they call when the scroll is sealed. You are still the one they fear but depend on. You are still the one who ends. And until the dream becomes more than dream, you will stay. Because the blade does not carry itself. Because the door does not open from this side. Because the dream for now is enough. There are days, seldom but unmistakable, when you hear a voice that is not your own. Not in the way that madmen do not with the clamor of spirits or the mutterings of saints, but a voice softer and deeper than your memory. As though it rises not from outside but from within, somewhere below thought and language speaking, in the hush between heartbeats, or in the long spaces between the cawing of distant crows. And when it comes, as it sometimes does, after a death too poorly done, or a burial too lonely, or a name too close to something you once loved, it does not call you by name or shout commands or whisper prophecy, but simply asks questions, quiet, persistent, difficult ones that rise like old bones from the wet earth of your soul. And though you do not answer them, though you try not to even hear them, you know they are true because they ask nothing that is not already known. And the first of these questions, the one that comes most often, always in that deep, unplaceable voice, is the simplest, the most terrible. Are you still a man, not a monster, not a shadow, not a mask, worn for others, but a man whole and real and unshattered, capable of kindness, not only in gesture, but in thought, capable of grief, not only as memory, but as motion, as action, as something that still reaches outward rather than collapsing inward. And you find when this voice speaks that you have no answer, or at least not one that fits neatly into the place where answers should live. Because so much of what once defined you, Hofter friendship, welcome warmth, has long since fallen away, worn down, not by any single cruelty or sharp trauma, but by the slow erosion of years spent behind the hood beside the block, beneath the eyes of 1,000 strangers who know your shape but never your story. You want to say yes. You want to say that you are still the boy who once stood beside his father's forge, and tried to guess the name of every villager who passed, who once fed sparrows from his palm and carved figures from apple wood to give to the weaver's daughter before she left for the coast. But the truth is, you have forgotten the names of most of those villagers, and the sparrows no longer land near your windowsill. And the applewood figures are gone, buried or burned or broken, and the weaver's daughter is a face with no voice, and the forge itself was sold long ago. And now when you stand before a man who is moments from death, and he asks with a cracked voice whether it will hurt you, no longer feel the ache in your chest that you once did. You only nod and place your hand gently on his shoulder and say, "It will be quick, not because it comforts him, though sometimes it does, but because it is the only truth you have left." And the second question, crueler still, is this: do they remember not the condemned, for they are beyond memory, beyond care, but the townspeople, the villagers, the ones who bring you their dead and their crimes and their silence, the ones who mutter your name with dread and then knock at your door when their child is fevered, or their husband lost in the woods, or their neighbor accused of theft. Those who fear you in the street, but follow you with their eyes on execution day, as if your movements were a kind of sacred liturgy. And you know when the voice asks that they do not remember, not in the way memory should work, not as recognition or respect, or even as warning, but only as habit, as repetition, as the way one remembers the shape of a tool but forgets the hand that guides it. And this forgetting, more than the fear, more than the isolation, is what eats at you. Because once, not long ago, but long enough that the season has turned since you stood in the square and looked at the faces gathered for the hanging of a man who had stolen a priest's mule. And in the third row was a boy, not quite a child, not yet a man, who looked up at you with wide, unblinking eyes. And there was something in his gaze that was not horror, not awe, but recognition. And in that moment, you realized that it was the baker's son, the same boy you once cradled when he was fevered with chills, and his mother came to your door, weeping with a name on her lips and hope in her eyes. And you had placed your hand on his head and whispered no words, but stayed beside him until the dawn. And now here he stood, taller, straighter, older, and he looked at you as if you were a stranger, or worse, as if he had never known you at all. So when the voice asks, do they remember what it means, is not, do they know who you are, but do they care? And the answer, however gently you try to twist it, however kindly you try to soften it, is no. And the third question, the one you dread most, the one that creeps into your thoughts, even in waking, is not about you, but about the world. Will it always be like this turning of the wheel, this steady procession of names and crimes and necks and ropes and axes and blood? This ritual dressed in justice but made from fear, this unchanging cycle where the faces blur and the scrolls pile high, and the rope is reused, and the axe resharpened, and the silence afterward grows deeper each time. And when you hear that question, there is a part of you, small and bitter and buried deep, that wants to say yes, because you have come to believe that nothing changes, that the world was made in shadow and will die in shadow, and that your place within it, lonely, steady, uncelebrated, is as eternal as stone. But there is another part of you, a quieter part, harder to reach, but harder still to kill, that says maybe not, that says perhaps someday there will be no need for executioners, no need for scrolls of death or crowds to watch the end, that says perhaps the voice that asks the questions is not merely doubt, but the seed of a world not yet born, a world where the weight you carry is no longer necessary, and the house at the edge of the village becomes only a house, and the man within it is allowed at last to live without the robe, without the rope, without the silence. And you do not answer the voice, because there are no answers, only listening, only surviving, only the steady, heavy knowledge that your day will come again, the knock will fall, the scroll will unroll, and the blade will gleam once more in the sun. But still, the questions return, and still you listen. Because listening is the one thing they cannot take from you. Because to listen is to remain alive even in the loneliest place. It was a spring morning, the kind that comes early and soft some years, with the sky thin and pale like bleached linen, and the grass pushing up in ragged patches along the paths, where hooves and boots had churned the earth into muck all winter. And you had not yet opened the shutters or drawn water or stirred the hearth. When the knock came, not the knock of the constable's fist or the bailiff's scroll, not the sound of fear or duty or anger, but a lighter tap, uncertain and hesitant. And when you stepped to the door and lifted the latch, you found not a mother with a sick child or a priest come to remind you of sin, but a boy no more than 9 or 10, with hair like straw and hands already rough from work, his tunic a little too big, and one boot unlaced. And he looked at you, not with awe or disgust or wariness, but with a kind of quiet bravery, the sort that children have before the world has taught them to be afraid of the things they do not understand. He did not speak at first, only stared, and you stared back, waiting until at last he lifted his chin and said simply, plainly, "Why do you do it?" And in that moment, with the breeze pushing at the door and the birds beginning their morning racket in the trees behind your house, you found that the question struck you harder than any name ever had, not because it was cruel or suspicious or loaded with adult accusation, but because it was pure, stripped of everything but wonder, and because it came from a mouth too young to lie, and eyes too clear to carry the weight of the world's opinions. And it asked not about justice, not about blood, not even about fear, but about you. You stepped aside and let him in. You do not know why. Perhaps because the question deserved it. Perhaps because you had never been asked before. He sat at your table with his hands folded like he was in church, and you poured him a cup of watered cider and gave him a heel of bread and sat across from him, unsure where to begin. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was not. Why do you do it? Because someone must. Because no one else will. Because the law is not a hand, but a parchment, and it needs someone to make it so. Because your father did it, and his father before him. Because the town cannot look death in the eye, so it looks at you instead. Because if it were left to chance to rage to the crowd, then there would be fire, not finality. Because the blade in your hand is better than the torch in another's. Because justice, if it can be called that, must be carried out by someone who understands its weight, not only the weight of the axe or the rope or the law, but the weight of the silence afterward. Because mercy is not always saying no to death. Sometimes it is making it quick. You did not say all these things aloud. You could not. They are not things a child can carry. But you said some of them, and he listened, more than most ever have. You told him the blade must be sharpened daily. You told him the robe is heavy. You told him that when the body falls, it makes a sound unlike any other. You told him that no one claps, and if they do, they are fools. And when you finished, he asked if you were sad, and you said yes. Not every day, but often. And then he said the thing you have never forgotten, the thing that slipped into your chest and never left, no matter how many scrolls came or ropes were tied or graves were dug. He said, "I think it's good that you do it, because I think if someone else did it, they might like it." And then he thanked you and stood and left. No name, no reason. Just that single shining sentence still lodged like a smooth stone in your chest after all these years. You do not know who he was. You never saw him again. But you remember. You remember the sound of his boots on the path. You remember the scrape of the cup on the table. You remember that for one morning your house was not silent. And for one morning you were not feared. You were simply seen. And though it did not change your work, though the blade remained sharp, and the rope remained coiled, and the scrolls kept coming, something inside you eased ever so slightly, as if the weight of your role had shifted a little to one side, made room for something warmer, something quieter, a belief not in justice, nor law, nor order, but in the idea that someone somewhere might understand. Not fully, not easily, not without years and death and silence, but truly. And sometimes on spring mornings when the frost has melted and the grass has returned, when you step outside and the sun is low and golden on the dew, you find yourself looking down the road and wondering if he remembers, if he knows you still think of him, if he knows that his question, gentle, impossible, holy, was the only one you never turned away. And if he came back now, taller, older, with the weight of the world pressed into his shoulders, and he asked you again, why do you do it? You would say, because no one else would do it like I do. And because once a child asked me why, and I realized I needed to be the one who could answer. There are days, though, they are few and never spoken of, when the scrolls do not come, when no one is accused, when the magistrate's chamber remains shuttered and quiet, when the priest delivers sermons on mercy instead of judgment, when no one steals or fights or kills, or perhaps more likely, when the crimes are hidden better, or forgiven sooner, or forgotten entirely by those who have the power to remember only what suits them. And on those rare pale days when the square stands empty and the rope hangs untouched, and the axe sits quietly on its shelf with its edge still clean, there comes upon you a strange, heavy silence. Not the silence of fear or aftermath or waiting, but the silence of pause, of interruption, of a life that has become so used to one rhythm that the absence of it makes everything else feel unreal, as though the world itself has forgotten to draw breath. And it is then, in that unfamiliar stillness, that you notice the shape of your house more sharply, the angle of light on the floorboards, the creak in the third step, the way the air smells of old wood and smoke and damp earth, and you feel with a kind of gentle unease that you are standing in a place you know but do not quite recognize, like returning to a childhood home after many years and finding the ceilings lower than you remembered, the hearth smaller, the silence louder. You clean the tools anyway. You draw the water. You hang the robe by the door. You prepare the body for a task that does not come. And when the hours pass and no messenger arrives, you sit with your hands on your knees and your thoughts moving in slow, uncertain spirals. And you begin to wonder, not aloud, not in any way that would make a sound, but in that deep inner place where questions are stored like seeds waiting for rain, who you are when you are not being what the world requires of you. For so long your life has been measured by need, by the arrival of scrolls, by the weight of crime, by the opening and closing of traps and knots and flesh, that to be unneeded even for a day is not a freedom, but a kind of disorientation, a stepping into a room where the floor is tilted and the windows do not match the view you remember, and you find yourself watching your own hands, tracing the lines and calluses, wondering what else they might have done in another life, or what else they could do now, if not bound to the axe, to the blade, to the sacred and terrible duty that has made your name into a silence and your body into a symbol. You think perhaps of how it might feel to build something, not gallows, not graves, but a bench or a cart or a cradle. You think of the grain of the wood beneath your fingers, not as instrument of death, but of support, of comfort, of movement. You think of the fire in your hearth as something to cook over, not just to return to after the last act is done. You think of laughter, not yours, perhaps, but someone else's, filling the space where now only the wind whistles and the kettle sings. But these thoughts do not stay long. They are delicate things like moths that drift close to the flame but never touch it. Because you know, even in the quiet, that the stillness will not last, that a name will come, that someone will do something they should not, or be accused of something they did not. And the world will turn to you again, not because it loves you or respects you or even sees you, but because it needs you, because it has always needed someone to bear the blade to carry the final word when all others have fallen silent. And so you do not let the stillness deceive you. You do not trust it. You sit with it, yes. You listen to it. You breathe it in like a rare scent carried on a wind from far away. But you do not unpack your life into it, because you know it is not a room you can stay in, only pass through. Still on these days, these still rare, weightless days, you try. You boil an egg. You mend a tear in your cloak. You take off your boots and walk barefoot in the grass behind your house where the graves lie quiet and the birds do not fear you as much as people do. You hum sometimes, a tune you do not remember learning, one your father may have hummed, or one that simply rose in you like mist from the soil. You do not think of it as joy. It is not joy. It is being. It is the moment before the name comes again. It is the breath before the plunge. It is the space between the notes. And though it vanishes by nightfall, though the scroll arrives before sunrise the next day, with a name written in dark ink and the weight of law pressed into the wax, you hold the memory of the stillness with you, like a warm stone tucked into the pocket of your coat. And later, when the act is done, when the blood has dried and the body has been lowered, when the priest has refused the blessing and the crowd has turned its back, and you are left again with your tools and your silence, you return to that stone, that quiet memory, that soft, uncertain moment, when the axe was still, and the door did not open, and the world forgot for just a little while to ask for your hands. You hold it. Not like a hope, for hope is a thing too fragile, and you are too far gone for it now, but like a memory of something true, something that proves you are still more than the sum of your tasks, more than the robe and the blade and the name that makes children hide and women cross themselves. You are still a man, and for one day the axe was still, and so for a time were you. There comes a moment once in a lifetime, if you are careful, more. If the world is cruel, when the rope breaks, when the knot slips, or the gallows beam groans, or the fibers weather-worn and too long reused simply fail to hold the weight they were never meant to carry again and again, without rest, and the body, instead of swinging cleanly, sharply, finally, instead of snapping at the neck like a reed, beneath the boot heel of the law falls with a dreadful, sickening thump to the platform below, gasping or moaning, or still in silence, and the crowd, which only moments ago stood hushed or muttering or rapt, turns as one into something else, into teeth, into breath, into panic or protest or laughter. And all eyes suddenly turn not to the condemned, not to the heavens, not even to the magistrate, but to you, because this is your rope, your gallows, your hand, your failure. And though the law may say that the sentence must be carried out again, that the man must be hanged properly, that the error is only delay and not reprieve, you know, in that moment, that the law's voice has gone quiet and meaningless in the roar of the crowd, because it is you who must now climb the scaffold, against, not as the solemn figure of justice, but as the fool, the butcher, the faltering hand. And though your blade has never missed, and your hands are steady even now, you feel in your stomach a hollowing that has no name, because the ritual has broken, and what comes next will not be clean. You remember the first time it happened, not in youth, but not recently, either on a cold morning when the square was slick with frost, and the breath of every villager rose in slow white clouds above their heads like prayers. And the man whose name had been written out 3 times in 3 hands was old, older than most, who come to the rope thin with hunger, and silent as they tied his wrists, silent as they looped the cord, vigilant as he stepped forward, with knees that did not bend well. And it was not until the moment came the trap opened, and the rope held him only long enough to catch the air in his throat, and then snap that he made a sound, just one. A kind of startled exhale like someone waking from a dream. They did not mean to leave, and you remember the gasp of the crowd, and the shout of the bailiff, and the stumbling of the guards who reached him too slowly, and how he lay there blinking up at the gray sky, not dead, not yet, and how your hands, for the first time in years, trembled as you reached down and touched his pulse, because you knew what must be done but did not know if you could do it again. Not just because of the weight of the eyes around you, or the muttering that had begun, or the murmured prayers and curses, but because something inside you had recoiled at the failure. Not only the failure of the rope, but the failure of the ritual, the clean end, the belief, however thin, that death, when given properly, might offer something like mercy. You did it, of course. You always do. The rope was replaced. The man was raised. The end came. But it did not come cleanly. It came like a groan from the earth, slow and reluctant, and when it was over, and the body was taken, and the crowd dispersed in uneasy silence, you returned to your house and did not light the fire, and you sat in the cold, with the rope coiled on the table before you, and you stared at the place where the fibers had frayed, and you did not curse it, and you did not weep, you simply watched, and you understood, in a way you had not understood before, that failure in your work is not merely mistake, it is unforgiveness. Because a proper death given rightly allows the world to move forward, allows the people to believe that wrong has been answered, and order has been restored. But a broken rope leaves a question in the air that no scroll can answer, no priest can sanctify, no blade can resolve. And you, more than anyone, must carry that question home with you, must sit with it, like an unwelcome guest at your hearth, must learn to live with the knowing that something once absolute has cracked. And from that day onward, you check the ropes more often. You test the beams with your own hand. You retie knots that others swear are sound. You speak less on execution mornings, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because you have seen what happens when the death is not clean. And you know that though the law will call it justice all the same, the soul of the act has gone missing. And yet, despite all this, it happens again. Not often, but again. Because ropes wear, because mistakes are made, because sometimes death refuses to come easily, and each time the crowd grows uglier, more fearful, more eager for blame. And you who already live in the silence between them must carry not only the failure of the rope, but the failure of the belief that this task could ever be controlled entirely. There are nights when you dream of broken ropes, not of the condemned, not of their faces, or their names, or the way their knees gave out, or their breath rattled in their throats, but of the moment, that sickening moment, when the rope breaks, and the ritual collapses, and the world loses its footing, and your hand, no matter how sure, no matter how slow, are no longer enough to hold the weight of the law. And you wake with your hands clenched, and you walk outside before the sun has risen, and you sit by the old stone near the path where no one follows you, and you place the rope there, and you look at it, and you ask no questions, because there are none, only knots, only weight. Only the long, slow learning that sometimes the things that should hold us simply do not. And still you rise. Still you climb the scaffold. Still you take the rope in your hands, because the law remembers the name, but the rope remembers the fall. There is no scroll yet, no rider galloping through the village gate, no seal cracked, no name whispered in the square with that slow, dreadful finality that always seems to hang heavier in the morning frost. But you feel it coming, not like dread, not like hope, but like weather, like the scent of rain hours before the clouds gather, like the long pressure of seasons turning even before the leaves change. And you cannot say why not exactly. Only that the stillness has begun to settle too firmly on your bones, and the tools have begun to feel too familiar in your hands, and the silence you once wore like a cloak now hangs too thickly around your throat. And when you move through your house, each step sounds louder than it ought to, as though the walls are listening, as though the rooms themselves are waiting for something to end. And you begin to wonder, not out of fear, but out of the weariness that grows from long service, long solitude, long silence. How many more names will come? How many more ropes you must tie? How many more eyes you must meet in the final moment, before the blade or the drop, or the last breath? How many more times you must walk the scaffold stairs and hold your body still while your heart drifts away from the crowd? How many more nights you will return with hands aching and mouth dry and no voice to speak, even if you had someone to speak to. And in that wondering you begin to see, without clarity but with certainty, that there must come a last name, a final sentence not only for those you serve but for you, the hand behind the law, the weight behind the ritual, the figure who has outlived the crimes he was summoned to end. You do not imagine it dramatically. There will be no ceremony, no parchment thanking you for years of silent labor, no magistrate's nod, no crowd assembled for your retirement, no child laying flowers at your door, only a day when the scroll does not come, and the next day after it, and another, and you will wait as you always have, with robe laid out and blade cleaned, and then a week will pass, and then a season, and still your name will not be called, and slowly, like dust gathering in corners, the truth will arrive that they no longer need you, not because the world is better, but because it has forgotten, because someone else now stands at the scaffold, or because punishment has changed its shape again and no longer requires your hands, or because the town in its strange, slow-turning way has turned at last without turning to say goodbye. And you will sit with that, and you will not protest, because your task was never to be seen, only to be present. And your reward, if it can be called that, was not praise, but the small dignity of being steady when the world could not be. Still, you will look at your tools, at the axe now dulled, at the ropes now softened, at the robe now thin at the shoulders, and you will feel something that is not quite grief, but is kin to it, the ache of having been used fully and now set aside. And in that ache, you will remember. You will remember not the names, not all of them, not even most of them, but the moments, the way the air smelled just before a summer hanging, the way a widow clutched her shawl as you passed, the way the first snow fell as you buried a man who had cursed your name and wept at the end anyway, the way the bells tolled one extra time the day your father died, and the town pretended not to notice. You will remember the quiet. You will remember the hands that reached for yours, not in hatred, not in fear, but in need and in farewell. You will remember the question asked by the boy with the 2 large boots, and the answer you never fully spoke aloud, that you do it not because you want to, not because you must, but because someone must, and you would rather it be your hands than another's, because you have learned painfully and thoroughly how to carry the weight and how to let it pass into the earth without leaving the world in ruin. And when the very last name does come, when at last the door knocks and the scroll is pressed into your hands and the wax is still warm and the name within it is not unfamiliar but deeply, deeply known, when you open it and see quietly and with the understanding of a man who has always known this moment would come, that it is your own, you will not flinch. You will fold the scroll. You will place it on the table. You will stand. You will breathe. And you will walk the road alone, not to the gallows perhaps, but to the tree behind the field, or the stone by the creek, or the grave already dug, in the place only you have ever visited. Because you are the end of many things. And now at last, it is your time to end. And now, dear one, the story is nearly done. The axe has been set down. The robe is folded one last time. The rope hangs loose and silent in the still air. The house at the edge of the village no longer waits for footsteps. And the man within it, who asked for nothing and received even less, has walked into the place beyond punishment, beyond duty, beyond the reach of law. Let the silence settle now. Let your breath slow. The scaffold stands empty in the square, and the crows have flown to quieter branches. The crowd has gone home. The names have all been spoken. The scrolls have all been burned. The blade does not need sharpening. The knots do not need tying. The weight has been lifted gently, quietly, without a sound. And now the executioner, whose name you never needed to know, lies in rest beneath a stone no one marked in soil he once dug for others, beneath trees that bend in the wind, like mourners who do not speak but remember all the same. You can let your eyes close if they haven't already. There is no one left to judge you, no one left to condemn. Only stillness. Only the hush after the last story is told. And in that hush, let your thoughts drift softly like ash over water, like snow falling into the folds of an old robe, like breath leaving the body, not in fear, but in peace. The task is done. The blade is at rest. The world for a while is quiet again. Sleep now. Sleep well.